Tucked away in the forgotten photos of our past is a collection of bizarre images. These images hold the secrets of an absurd, macabre, and questionable history that never made it into the textbooks. This ominous, gray-looking scene was taken in Stockholm, Sweden, of the Stockholm Tower. This image was captured in 1890, after the tower was constructed in 1887. The old Stockholm telephone tower was a metal construct that was built to connect more than 5,500 telephone lines in the Swedish capital. When the patent of the telephone emerged, there was a race to connect everyone to the phone grid. Since the idea was fairly new, no one knew that they could bury these cables instead of having them strewn across the city. The cables, though, couldn't stay littered across residential homes, so the tower was put into place as a meeting point. The central hub spread at a length of 240 feet and was visible in the skyline at any point. Each telephone needed its own physical line that would be strung between the business or house to a phone exchange. In order to accommodate the thousands upon thousands of individual lines, unsightly towers were needed. The Telefonternet was one of Sweden's telephone exchanges. The cables went in various directions, giving it an apocalyptic and hazardous look. This image makes it easy to recognize the absurdity of the tower and how dangerous the whole endeavor was, which only worsened during the winter months. Everything that could have possibly gone wrong with this invention did. High winds damaged cables, along with ice storms and fires. This network was incredibly vulnerable to the elements, and if it fell, it would be a tremendous hazard for the whole town. Connecting grids were known to fall on houses, breaking rooftops and exposing the residents to the elements as well. More historical images of this odd period litter the Museum of Technology. The era of the Telefonternet was divided into 3 categories on the museum's listing. One of them shows how electricians and builders dangerously stood on one of the telephone towers, connected with lines that would travel to the tower. It also revealed the hazards that the constructs posed in the form of damaged buildings and blocked roads. Another album called Telefonstationer Stockholm revealed the control center where the cables were alarmingly sent through. The last album was dedicated to the Stockholm Tower, which could be seen from any angle at any place in the city, as it towered ominously over the buildings. Luckily though, phone networks were quick to evolve. By 1913, these dangerous-looking towers, like Telefonternet, were decommissioned in favor of a simpler technology. The construct, though, still stood there as a landmark and was used as a billboard at one point. It then caught fire in 1953 and was subsequently demolished. This picture is exactly what it looks like. It's a motorcycle chariot race, a daredevil routine performed shockingly by the New South Wales Police at the New South Wales Police Carnival of 1936. There were many daring features that took place at the Sydney Showground, including dogs jumping through flaming hoops. 2 daredevil police officers would race around the track in a dangerous motorcycle stunt. The earliest record, though, of these races seems to date back to 1933, during the Police and Firemen's Carnival. According to the Sydney Morning Herald, this spectacular production also took place at the Sydney Showgrounds, where racers were equipped with a V-twin Harley-Davidson that was bolted abreast. The daring acts that take place here are like scenes from a movie, Ben-Hur, a 1925 silent film to be exact. 2 boys in blue decided to recreate the scene in the movie, except they replaced the horses with motorcycles. Both of the men, while seated on a flimsy chariot with full-sized Harley-Davidson wheels, must control the bikes simultaneously as they make their way around the track. If a photograph wasn't enough to convince the public that this was a real event that took place, one video was taken. The footage came through the form of Fox Movietone News on the 7th of March, 1936. For about 55 seconds, it appears to be just a regular parade until the motorcycles come in, revealing the daring race. According to the Popular Mechanics magazine, the chariots were made from old wine barrels with automobile wheels attached to them. A pair of leather reins were attached to the Harley's handles, while the charioteer had to steer himself around. The method used in controlling these riderless Harleys was to attach each rein to each motorcycle's throttle, allowing the charioteer to control both of them at the same time, and at different speeds. Motorcycle chariot races were popular around this time, and weren't unique to the Sydney showground. One daring rider took it one step further, attaching 3 motorbikes to his slapped-together chariot while he was dressed as a Roman-era charioteer. This sport also found its way to Germany during the same period. A 1938 newspaper article shows one German performer holding the reins of 4 motorbikes attached to his rubber-tired chariot. All of the bikes this time are supported and attached by 3 horizontal bars. While the traditional Harley-Davidson chariot racing has dwindled in recent years, there are still some enthusiasts who keep the idea alive. Jack Field is one such enthusiast, who created his chariot from what appears to be a trailer supported by 2 wheels. Instead of horses or Harleys, though, he used Husqvarna motorcycles with rods to control the throttle and brake controls. This seems like a safer option compared to the leather reins that were used in the 30s. There's a whole history behind the lethal-looking races, which sparked modernized versions today. In 1897, this picture of George Moore and Fred Ho, 2 circus performers who went by their stage name, the Living Skeleton and the Fat Man, were quite the pair of the world's most comical boxers. They captivated audiences across the country with the circus sideshow act. Their routine performance strangely stemmed from doctor recommendations. Both of these men needed to increase their exercise. One needed to gain weight, while the other needed to lose it. The 2 realized that they could turn their conditions into a performance that would lead them to travel the world and generate a living income. George was an extremely gaunt man. He was born in Helena, Montana, to a father who owned a dry goods shop. Until the age of 21, George worked in the shop while stirring the desire to travel the world. George's unusual body stemmed from a medical condition known as Marfan syndrome. It's a genetic issue that affects connective tissues. During his 20s, he would get his wish when the first major circus rolled into town and offered him a position to exhibit himself as the Living Skeleton. Of course, he closed the offer at once. He would then meet Fred, and they would become great friends. Fred's father was a carpenter. He too would learn the trade, but as he continued to gain more pounds, he opted for a different life. This life, of course, was the Forepaugh Circus, where he was revered as the Fat Man. It was here that he would meet his sparring partner. After both receiving separate advice regarding their physiques, they decided to combine a much-needed exercise with pleasure. This is where the boxing journey began. The 2 friends would practice boxing for a long time together, privately, before bringing it to the stage. This was prompted by the circus manager, who heard about the private boxing practice. He arranged to view a round or 2, and concluded that they should face one another on stage in front of the audience. This would increase their salary and a long-term engagement. Later in life, both men grew in their profession, not only becoming expert boxers, but also the perfect comedians. Their routines have been described as uproariously funny. George stood at a height of 6 feet and 3 inches and weighed just 97 pounds, while Fred stood 4 foot 2 inches tall and weighed 422 pounds. The 2 men's performances gave them the financial support they needed. Many onlookers would be attracted to this bizarre show and unusual performance, providing the anomalies with a steady income. The sideshow industry may seem controversial now due to concerns about ethics and exploitation, but back then it was a prevalent form of entertainment that put food on the tables. Sideshows often feature people with unusual traits, medical conditions, or amazing talents. Fred and George's unique routine, though, emphasized a broader tradition, where spectacle meets curiosity. The story of these 2 men is an example of how different individuals could find a way to transform their circumstances into a means of living and entertainment, with their acts serving as a testament to resilience and creativity. This image definitely looks like one taken from a horror movie about a cult that meets out in a secluded forest, engaging in ritualistic activities, summoning ancient entities. They're the Straw Boys of Ireland, an eccentric tradition that's unique to Irish culture. While the exact way in which the tradition began is not clear, it's known that it originated in Western countries. During local weddings, a group of men referred to as the Straw Boys would pop up uninvited. They were dressed in sheaves of straw, formed into a conical hat shape to hide their identities. It's an old marriage custom. During their random, unwelcomed presence on the happy day, the Straw Boys would do a dance with the bride and the groom. Even though they took on an ominous appearance with an atmosphere of mischief, the presence of these men was actually viewed as bestowing of luck upon the newlyweds as well as wealth and health. The group would also play music while providing a lively performance, exciting the families that attended. They'd often be offered food or drinks in exchange for more entertainment or appeasement. In more modern accounts of the Straw Boys, they were referred to as wedding crashers, with groups of them crashing receptions, performing tricks and magic for the guests, and demanding dances from the happy couple. Once the boys had drunk enough of the served beverages and bid the couple good luck, they left and headed back to their homes. One description of the Straw Boys came from a note from 1938. It explained that on the night of one wedding, the Straw Boys arrived at the house where the ceremony was being held. One batch had come from the groom, while another from the bride. The night prior to the wedding, the Straw Boys would meet up. During this meeting, they discuss heading to the bride's home. They turn their coats inside out and secure them with a rope. On the day of the wedding, they steal straw instead of asking for it and create hats from it. The hats travel down to their shoulders. The group will also decide who the captain is and who the sergeant is, both of which carry sticks. Upon their arrival, they'll knock on the door and wait for it to be answered. The captain calls for a dance with the bride, and later the groom. The Straw Boys then ask for the bridesmaids and groomsmen to gather on the dance floor where they must perform a half set. The Straw Boys shout, "I wish you all sorts of good luck." The group then heads out and declares that the groom is a decent man. In some areas where their tradition is prevalent, the boys would later burn the straw hats after the wedding. But this would only be done if their presence was well received. If they'd felt unwelcome, the hats would be cast into a tree. This way the whole town would know that the newlyweds were abrasive and rude. According to a historian, the Straw Boys weren't the only custom at the time. Other traditions that weren't limited to weddings would make regular appearances throughout the year. On St. Brigid's Day, groups of biddy boys would visit their neighbors with a straw effigy of St. Brigid. Another tradition takes place on the first day of May, where May boys visit towns and villages dressed up in elaborate disguises, adorned with flowers and ribbons. They paraded around playing music in celebration of the first day of summer. One Irish tradition is still ongoing today, but has been weakened in recent years. It's the presence of the Wren Boys, who make an appearance on St. Stephen's Day. Each of these groups, though, are branch-offs of the Straw Boy tradition. They make use of wicker, straw, leaves, and goat skin to complete their natural but creepy looks. This grotesque, Halloween-looking costume is a shame mask that's currently housed at the Medieval Crime Museum in Germany. It was used in Germany in the 17th century, and various other versions were used. Its purpose was to instill a feeling of shame in the wearer, who was forced to use it for committing a crime. This would certainly alert the community to the fact that you committed some sort of minor offense. The Middle Ages were a time when identity and civility were based upon the dichotomy of honor and the same. Laws came into existence throughout Europe to establish a system that humiliated minor criminals. Each person born in this era was born with a certain amount of honor that was dependent on community and social class. They would then lose their honorable status by committing acts that were viewed as shameful, such as marrying someone of the lower class. People, of course, feared shame because losing honor meant that their lives were ruined. Associating with any shameful person, even sitting next to them, would immediately diminish that honor. The Germans at this time believed that the crime committed by one person would infect the entire community, and therefore there had to be some form of punishment that would restore their honor. Instead of focusing on reforming the criminals, Germans sought to deter others from making the same mistakes. This is where the act of throwing rotten vegetables at someone came into play. Eventually, this act didn't seem like enough, and the handmakes were brought into existence. The masks were made of mortifying designs, like the initial witch-like mask. Other designs took on modifying appearances with donkey ears, pig noses, and long tongues. Each mask referred to a specific minor crime, which was mostly targeted at women. A mask with a long nose may indicate that the wearer is being nosy, while huge eyes, ears, or a mouth indicate eavesdropping, spying, or gossiping. A lot of the time, they adorned the faces of women deemed too talkative. A few of the handmakes had chains attached to them so that the ones who wore them could be guided and paraded through the village to ensure that everyone saw them. Otherwise, the purpose of the shame mask wouldn't be upheld. These contraptions were obviously uncomfortable to wear. They were a cold, heavy, unyielding metal. Occasionally, a mouthpiece would be added to inflict pain while talking or eating in more extreme cases. This would physically silence the person who wore it and would lead to mouth fatigue and drooling. And in some cases, one would be forced to wear the rooster mask for hours and sometimes a full day. The long-tongued masks were used for gossipers, while the long-eared type was placed on the heads of eavesdroppers. Tavern drunks or unkempt people would be forced to eat the pig snout mask. England and Scotland would present their own version too during the same era. They called them the Scold's Bridle and sometimes the Brank. The punishment would befall the perpetrator who committed the same acts, with the extension of excessive rudeness, such as being rash or shrewd. The Scold's Bridle, though, was a bit more hostile than the German version. It was designed to prevent the wearer from speaking or sharing opinions, which would force them into submission. This version also didn't hide the wearer's face, but allowed it to be clearly visible. Ironically, though, even though gossip was a punishable crime, spreading rumors about who was wearing the mask was somehow acceptable and added to the offender's embarrassment. During the Middle Ages, Europe had seen an increase in anxiety relating to women's speech. It was during this time that texts were in circulation thanks to the printing press. Women were able to access the written word, which instilled fear about them speaking out of the boundaries of domestication. Moral feminine behavior discouraged reading texts, but still, this era saw an explosion of female writers, even with the shame mask system in place. Pictured here is Francesco Lentini, also known as the Three-Legged Wonder. His story began in Rossellini on the 18th of May, 1889. Two farmers, Natalie and Giovanna Falco, lived on a farm at 9 Gentoli Street. They already had 4 children, which would later expand to 12, with Francesco being the 5th of the bunch. Wrapped in the very cotton swaddling that once held his maternal grandmother, the newborn was abruptly placed into the reed basket that was stored under the bed, while the midwife, Maria Alberino, ran from the room screaming with terror. This caught the attention of other women who were there for Giovanna's birth. Each came into the room and left in tears without telling the mother what was happening. Once she was alone, Giovanna received the reed basket and unwrapped the cotton swaddling. She soon understood the reason for the weeping. Natalie would later return from harvesting hay and took a look at his son. He saw no error in the newborn, but rather viewed him as the will of the Almighty. This outlook, though, was not long-lasting. Rumors began to circulate as to how he came to be. Some believed that when Giovanna visited a carter, she became disquieted by the craftsman's table, which rested only on 3 legs. The superstitious village believed that the child was a punishment and labeled Francesco an abomination. The parents refused the child and left it in the care of Natalie's aunt. Later, though, they reclaimed him and began taking him to specialists as he grew. The older he got, the more he adapted to live with 3 legs and 4 feet, one of which was rested by his knee and remained underdeveloped. He also had an extra rib and a rudimentary tailbone. This was all the result of a conjoined twin. Custom pants and 3 shoes to adorn each of his feet were crafted for him, and he learned to sleep with his extra leg resting on a nearby trunk. Francesco, however, saw the light in this situation and was exhibited in many cities, including London. He would begin performing for the Ringling Brothers Circus in his adulthood. In 1906, he made his debut with the Barnum Circus and toured many times across Europe and the United States, drawing a larger crowd each time. His 40-year-long career also placed him on sideshows like Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. His peers respected him so much that they often referred to him as the King. He would also be nicknamed the Three-Legged Football Player for using his extra leg to kick a football across the stage. In 1907, he married Teresa Murray and had children, continuing his life as a loving husband, father, and performer despite his condition. Later, though, he and Teresa split, and he began a new life with Helen Shoup. There are still some descendants of Francesco's line living today. Francesco had Sicilian features, including a height of 5 feet and 6 inches, gray eyes, a dark complexion, and brown hair. He finished school through 8th grade with the help of a tutor. At the age of 77, after living a full life, he passed away on tour. But this was not the end of his legacy. In 2017, a reference to him was made in the film The Greatest Showman. He also appeared on the back cover of Alice in Chains' self-titled album, with the front cover being a three-legged dog. The 1960s was a time of brainwashing children into thinking that the future would be full of flying cars, treadmills, sidewalks, and levitating schools in the sky. The Jetsons was a children's TV show that brought about these different resources. They also seemed to have a preconceived idea of artificial intelligence, with the addition of Rosie, the Jetsons' maid. She appeared in only 2 episodes of the 1962 to 1963 run. The show, of course, took on a futuristic setting. Today, we find that artificially intelligent robots are a thing of the present and the future. Or so we thought. While robots aren't particularly a new development, the idea of them being intelligent is. But one invention from 1966 says otherwise. One man decided that the maid-like robot shouldn't just be a thing on the TV screen, and took to creating one himself. Dennis Weston, a Leeds, England resident, believed that Rosie should be a real-life invention. So he embarked on an adventure to create Tinker, the remote-controlled robot maid. Tinker could do a variety of human-like chores, including washing its owner's car, weeding the garden, and even taking a baby for a stroll down the road. Owners could even take these robots on shopping trips. It seemed almost too good to be true, and it was. The catch was that Tinker could only venture 200 yards beyond Dennis's garage, as he controlled the robot with the remote. Many historical photographs have emerged from the era in which this bot was being used, but they were never brought to recent textbooks. Pictured here is one of the main things that Tinker could do, washing its owner's car. Despite being ahead of its time, the bot looks as one would expect it to for the 60s. It looks as though it was built from garage junk with vacuum pipe-like arms and random sheets of metal. Tinker was equipped with a Zoom TV camera, which allowed owners to see what it was seeing. 120 electronic motors, memory, and 29 signal-receiving channels. But Dennis soon ran out of space with his many other inventions, and this maid-tasked robot was passed along to a family friend in 1974. His name was Brian, and he owned Leeds Radio Shop during the 60s and 70s. It was here that he sold Army surplus radio equipment. It was guessed that the beloved Tinker met a similar fate as most of the gear that ended up at Brian's shop, which was to be stripped for spare parts. Dennis Weston made many inventions in his lifetime, which he jotted down on cigar packets. In 1995, he passed away, and Tinker, an invention that was never fully realized, was forgotten. One would think that this was the end of the robot story. Much to our surprise, though, in 2012, it was revealed that Tinker lives. Paul Weston, the grandson of Dennis Weston, found the very bot that his grandfather invented. It was dusty, dented, and probably no longer operational. This is not some sort of optical illusion, a trick of invisible glass, or an unseen fence. What you see here is exactly what it looks like. A group of friends or family having a casual lunch among a congregation of alligators, the usual sort of event that one could expect from the early 1900s. The California Alligator Farm became a popular attraction during this time, since its establishment in 1907. Francis Ernest and Alligator Joe Campbell were the 2 men behind this outlandish attraction. That year, the 2 men opened a Los Angeles gator farm in the Lincoln Heights neighborhood. It quickly became the home of other reptiles like snakes, lizards, and crocodiles. The admission fee was just 25 cents at the time, and it was the city's most popular tourist attraction. A promotional brochure would soon do the rounds, claiming that the farm was host to alligators of all sizes, from babies to monstrous. The gators were fed chickens and ground meat. They'd be separated by size due to their cannibalistic instincts. Various photographs of this period began popping up, including the picnic in the middle of the congregation. The women seated there appeared fearless, but so were the other visitors in every other photograph. Tourists, especially youngsters, would saddle up a worthy beast and ride them across the park, where a makeshift chariot would be attached to them. Visitors would also pick up some of the smaller alligators and wrestle with the larger ones. One image even shows a woman lying beside a gator, a magazine in one hand and a cigarette in the other. Some would even be brave enough to attach one of these large beasts to a leash for a stroll around the park, while others bottle feed the hatchlings. The creatures would also have their own fun with 16-foot slides added to their enclosures, which led straight into a pond. Humans weren't the only kinds of visitors allowed here either. Various images have also come about of dogs simply hanging out with the alligators. Many photos of the California alligator farm show people interacting with the gators in these ways. One would assume that many fatalities occurred within this dangerous park, but strangely enough, there was not a single one. The only recorded incident was one young child being bit on the arm, leaving him with a simple scar as proof. Some of the alligators, though, escaped during the floods and probably headed for the sewers, hence the rumors we hear today. It also wasn't uncommon for local fraternity boys to break into the amusement park when no one was around and steal one or two of them. The farm's most famous inhabitant was Billy, who even starred in Hollywood films. According to the Los Angeles Times, almost every single scene with an alligator's jaw between 1910 and 1940 was Billy's. He would also be hailed as one of the highest paid non-human actors, earning $100 a day. He was the oldest gator in captivity, rumored to be 110 years old, and was prized for his learned trick of holding his jaw open on command. In 1953, the farm relocated to Buena Park, close to Knott's Berry Farm. The farm then housed 4 buildings containing over 100 displays that held snakes and lizards from all around the world. Other residents included snapping turtles, giant tortoises, and over 1,000 more species, leading to it becoming the largest reptile collection in the world. The gators would also become quite the neighbor's nuisance, with their nocturnal noises and the occasional stray in a nearby swimming pool. In the 1970s and early 80s, the amusement park realized the cruelty behind it all and began focusing on educating visitors about the creatures instead. This, of course, led to a decline in popularity and attendance, resulting in its closure in 1984. The animals were sold to a private Florida estate, and what became of them after that remains a mystery. We all thought that the fear of clowns stemmed from the release of Stephen King's It, or maybe even John Wayne Gacy. But perhaps it's the backstory of this creepy clown picture that really instilled the trepidation connected to these silly children's birthday party performers. This black and white image is taken from a 1924 American silent thriller, 1-hour-long film called He Who Gets Slapped. The film centers around a creepy, bitter clown who endeavors to save the young woman he loves from Baron Reginald, who betrayed him. The clown was initially a scientist named Paul Beaumont, but was betrayed by his colleague, Baron Reginald. Beaumont's act consists of him being slapped by other clowns, reliving his personal and professional humiliation with each slap. His horrifying yet silly persona took on a rather terrifying appearance. A pale white face stood out against the black and gray backdrop. Scar-like striped paint trotted over his eyes, and red lipstick turned his mouth into a forced upward smile. Completing the look was his large pleated ruff, a dark gown, and 3 separate clumps of hair jutting from his head. In this image, the character is taking on a curious pose. He looks toward the audience with a fear-instilling smile, darkened eyes, and his arms outstretched at his sides. Playing as the clown is an actor known for his role in multiple horror movies, Lon Chaney. This wasn't the only time that he acted the part of a creepy-looking clown. In 1928, Chaney opted for the role of Tito the Clown in the long-forgotten 1928 silent film called Laugh, Clown Laugh. The movie was a drama that mixed some elements of horror and whodunit. The melodrama follows the life of Tito, the clown who takes in an abandoned child, Simonetta. In her adulthood, though, the creepy clown becomes obsessed with her, but is outmatched by Count Luigi Ravelli, a younger and richer man, who's also not Simonetta's adopted father. Chaney starred in around 157 films, including The Phantom of the Opera, in which he stars as the masked presence the Phantom, and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, where he's the lead of Quasimodo. With his career starting in 1912, Chaney's reputation only grew with his ability to transform himself using nothing more than a bit of makeup, as he did in He Who Gets Slapped, an ability that would earn him the name Man of 1,000 Faces. Another vintage photograph that emerged from the forgotten archives was captured by Enrique Diaz in 1940. While it may look like something out of some cult-like horror movie, there's actually quite a rich history behind this image. It was taken in Mexico during the San Juan de los Lagos Fair. As seen in the image, a woman adorned with a crown of thorns and bandaged face is being guided by a man who holds her arm. Going almost unnoticed and blending in with her dress is a noble cactus, a sacred and medicinal plant. It gives the impression that the thorns are piercing through her chest, a symbol of sacrifice. This is a symbolic tribute to Our Lady of San Juan del Valle during a fair or celebration dedicated to her. The choice of costume represents both sacrifice and Catholicism. The celebrations, known as mandas, however, can be brutal in other ways. The idea behind them is to prove devotion to Our Lady. These journeys are made by foot from homes far away, occasionally dressed as the Virgin of San Juan. Some have gone to the extreme of walking on their knees, crawling, or carrying immense statues. These means of tribute are often done while fasting. One day each year, the festivities would commence, where people embark on a journey of self-punishment in an effort to ask for forgiveness or a miracle. The origins of this tribute have been lost to translation, but it all began back in 1623 in the Mexican town of San Juan de Lagos, which was later founded after the Spanish conquest. It was here that Spanish missionaries would install an image of the Virgin Mary in the church. The idea behind it was to assist the parishioners in their devotion. That year, a family of aerial acrobats rolled into town. They were eager to perform for the guests that evening, but during their performance, the daughter of the family, who was swinging from the ropes, lost her grip, slipping into a field of sharpened blades that the father insisted on having there. Everyone rushed to her side and found her unconscious and injured. It was then that a woman named Ana Lucia brought the image of Our Lady, placed it next to her, and healed her almost instantly. This was considered a miracle by the church, and the image became recognized from there on out as Our Lady of San Juan. The devotion would later be taken into the United States and toured to other areas. In 1949, Reverend Jose Maria Aspiazu of the San Juan Parish was permitted to foster a devotion to the entity, and so a reproduction of a statue that was inspired by the image was made and placed in the chapel. Thereafter, a shrine and a new church were built in dedication to Our Lady, and so began the ceremonies. At the end of January and beginning of February each year, a great pilgrimage would commence. The pilgrimage starts in neighboring towns as many gather in the city and approach the shrine to ask for forgiveness or a miracle. A feeling of spirituality descends over the town. In the 1970s, the devotion was revived in San Francisco, California, where a monthly mass would be celebrated. This image is reminiscent of the bizarre and extreme pilgrimages that would take place in celebration of Our Lady of San Juan. More than 3,000 years ago, ancient people in what is today Spain created a monument that would last the ages. Today, we know very little about these Neolithic people, who'd only recently started farming, but the structure that they made has provided at least some insight into this mysterious group. The Dolman of Manga is located in southern Spain. Today, it's known as one of the largest megalithic structures in Europe. The largest stone used to create it weighs as much as a blue whale and is 5 times heavier than the largest component of the more famous Stonehenge. Together, all the stones used to create the structure weigh as much as 2 Boeing 747 planes. But it isn't only the weight of the stones that has baffled archaeologists, since research into the site first began in the 19th century. It's easy to compare all Neolithic sites to Stonehenge. In this case, it's heavier and larger. It's also a few hundred years older than the oldest parts of Stonehenge's construction. The Dolman of Manga is believed to have been constructed sometime between 3750 and 3650 BC. Rather than a circle of stones, the dolmen is a chamber built into the bedrock. Trenches were dug into the rock, which the vertical stone that would make up the wall were then lowered into. During construction, up to 1/3 of the wall stones would have been buried. Then, once all the stone megaliths were in place, the bedrock was carved away to create the chamber that we see today. The chamber is 90 feet long, 20 feet wide, and 11 feet high. The chamber's floor is actually larger than its roof, as all the walls lean inwards at a surprisingly consistent angle. This small detail is one of the first clues about just how incredible the structure is, and why it remained so mysterious for so long. When archaeologists working on the site in the 19th century began, they couldn't imagine ancient people having the engineering skills capable of creating something so detailed. It's one of the few things we know about these people today. They were much more clever than we imagine people from the Copper Age to be. The constructors used what we call today sciences to create the dolmen. Geometry, geology, and astronomy all played an important role in the construction. A recent study uncovered some of the secrets of the builders. We now know how they moved the delicate stones half a mile without damaging them, and we have a good idea of the engineering knowledge they must have had to create the structure. But there are still mysteries that remain unanswered. Researchers now know how the dolmen was constructed, but why is still unknown. When it was first explored, archaeologists found the remains of hundreds of people. It was obvious that the dolmen served as a tomb, likely for many generations. The people buried here are believed to be important figures from the community, possibly local rulers and their families. Unfortunately, very little is known about the civilization, and why the people put so much effort into creating a tomb for them. It's believed that it was constructed in such a way as to withstand the seismic activity in the area. It may have had more spiritual significance. Researchers have suggested the stone structures were meant to symbolize something permanent and eternal. Why this location was chosen could also be significant, but something that researchers haven't unraveled yet. There seems to be some kind of astronomical significance to the layout of the chamber. It captures the sunrise on the summer solstice even though it doesn't face east, which is likely not a coincidence. But until we know more about the ancient builders, the true significance of the Dolman of Manga may remain unknown. In May of 2020, metal detectorists made an interesting discovery in a field in Yorkshire, England. Buried, one on top of the other, were 4 copper objects that had been hidden away for over 1,000 years. Together called the Rydale Horde, these objects provide some insight into what life was like in Roman Britain when these objects were buried. But who buried them and why is still an unsolved mystery. The objects were of a remarkable quality, even after having been buried for hundreds of years. The most striking of the 4 was the bust of a man's head. It was small enough to fit into the palm of a hand, but showed a remarkable level of detail, especially in the hair and the forked beard. The eye sockets were empty, creating an eerie expression, but experts believe that it may have once had colored glass or gemstones behind the eyes, making it appear much more lifelike and awe-inspiring to those who saw it. While the front of the bust is very detailed, the back is much simpler. The holes in the back of the bust told scholars that it once had been placed on a pole or a staff of some kind. There were no inscriptions saying when this was created or who it depicted, but scholars are confident that this is a bust of the Roman Emperor, Marcus Aurelius. Aurelius ruled from 161 to 180 and was known as the Philosopher King. He was also frequently depicted with the same forked beard as this bust. The bust likely once belonged to a priest of the imperial cult and is a very rare find today. The second object is more common. It's a small figure of a man riding a horse, and it's believed to be a depiction of the Roman god Mars. The area was once home to the 9th Legion. It was on the edge of the Roman Empire. Some soldiers would have been a familiar sight here. The third object is a decorative handle of a key or a bladed weapon. It was crafted to resemble the front half of a horse. The fourth object is the simplest, but also one that causes the most confusion. It's a simple plumb bob used by architects and landscapers to create straight lines. There's little wear and tear, suggesting it didn't get much use before it was buried. Why these objects were buried together is a mystery. The first 3 objects can all be explained relatively simply. The bust would have been an important religious symbol, and the statue of the god Mars would have been buried by a soldier as an offering to the god before he went into battle. The symbolism of the handle depends on whether it was once part of a key, as was originally thought, or a blade, as the museum website describes. A blade could have been symbolic of a sacrifice, while magic keys were a recurring symbol in ancient Roman religion. All these have a clear purpose in some kind of religious setting, and may have been buried by a priest from the imperial cult or a follower who somehow acquired the bust. But the plumb bob makes less sense. One theory is that this was used as a part of a ritual for a blessing before an act of landscaping, and may have been buried before a large project took place. Alternatively, it could simply have been the hoard of some metal worker who buried the items to collect them later to melt down the metal. The artifacts are now on display in a local museum, and will continue to puzzle experts for the foreseeable future. The Samoan island of Savai has been called the cradle of Polynesia and the soul of Samoa. It plays an important role in various Polynesian myths and legends, and is home to a mysterious monument that has baffled historians and local experts for centuries. The Pay Mound lies hidden in a dense jungle in the south of the island. Footpaths lead towards it, but it's easy to get lost, and difficult to make out the structure if vegetation hasn't been cleared away. It wasn't until the late 20th century that archaeological research began to uncover some of the secrets of the mound, and about the people who created it. Like many great monuments, the building of Pay Mound took place in stages, beginning around 1000 CE. It was the end of the so-called Samoan Dark Ages, a period of time without any new myths or stories, and few archaeological discoveries. The mound started much smaller than it is today, and was made from piles of basalt stones on top of a foundational base of volcanic rock. Over the centuries, the mound grew to a height of 12 meters. While it's been called a pyramid, the mound is flat on top and paved with smooth stones from the local rivers or the coast. But what makes the Pay Mound so strange is the shape. When viewed from above, it resembles an 8-pointed star or cog. Archaeologists have found a few clues that could hint at explanations for the mysterious mound. The first discovery is that it was built on top of a much more ancient village. The first settlements in the area date back to around 2,000 years, and a second settlement phase came just before the first building stage commenced. Surveys of the area have found sunken roads and what could be the remains of a much larger settlement around the Pay Mound. It could be proof of a flourishing Samoan population that was much higher than original estimates, shortly before the European Age of Discovery. Archaeologists have also discovered kilns with traces of key plants inside. The plant was believed to have medicinal properties and played a role in religious or cultural ceremonies. Put together, it seems likely that the mound had some kind of cultural or religious significance, but there are no records or stories about what this significance was. Oral histories from the local area explain that cairns found on top of the mound were built after it was abandoned, sometime in the 1600s or 1700s. But the same stories don't explain why the mound was abandoned, or what happened there before. In ancient times, Roman historians wrote about a port city that they called the first emporium of India. Located somewhere on the western coast of South India, the Port of Muiris was an important trade hub for hundreds of years. But when the city disappeared from ancient maps, its location was lost and today remains a mystery. Muiris went the way of cities such as Troy, becoming more of a legend in modern times. It was obviously a city of great wealth. It was variously described as the city where liquor abounds, and a place that bestows wealth to its visitors indiscriminately. Gold deliveries were made by ocean-going ships from far-off lands. It was an uneven trade in many cases. Muiris provided more than its trading partners could afford. Those trading partners vary depending on the time period. Even when the Roman writer Pliny the Elder was writing about the port, it was ancient. Muiris dates back to at least 3000 BC, when it traded with the Babylonians, Assyrians, and Egyptians. Later, traders from Rome would make the trip, crossing overland through Egypt before taking a ship to the Horn of Africa and east to the Indian subcontinent. It was this connection to Rome that made it so curious to modern historians. According to Pliny, Rome had a significant trade deficit with India, and most of that was money that went to Muiris. The focus of the trade was black pepper. The ancient Romans couldn't get enough of the spice, which featured in many dishes at that time, but wasn't grown within the empire. The trade meant that Muiris appeared on maps from ancient Rome, but it also meant that when Rome stopped trading with the city, it seemed to fall into obscurity. Rome's economy started to falter during the 3rd century, and within a few hundred years, all mentions of Muiris stopped. There was no money for pepper from across the sea. What happened to the city after that is something of a mystery. Many believed that the port of Muiris became Kodungalar, another important port on the coast. Kodungalar rose to prominence in later centuries, but it was here where explorers from Europe traded up until 1341. It was then that a catastrophic flood occurred, changing the coastline forever and wiping Kodungalar from the map. When archaeologists started to explore the remains of Kodungalar, that conclusion was thrown into doubt. There were many artifacts from the 13th and 14th centuries. It had obviously been an important port, but there was very little from earlier periods, and nothing from what could have been Roman times. But there was a different story taking place 11 kilometers away. The small village of Patanum doesn't seem out of the ordinary today. But during monsoon season, glass beads are washed out of the soil to be collected by local children. These beads caught the attention of archaeologists, who began to explore this area. In just a few archaeological trenches, researchers found hundreds of thousands of artifacts, including Roman coins and pottery. Even the name Patanum suggests something unusual about the village's history. The name means market town or trade port, and would be more fitting of somewhere like Muiris than this small village. There's still debate about whether Patanum is actually the site of the ancient city, but if that is the case, the mystery remains as to why Muiris disappeared. It may have been linked to the lack of trade from ancient Rome, but the city had existed long before Rome, and it seems unlikely that the disappearance of one trade partner could have caused it to disappear entirely. The Hittite Empire was one of the great powers during the Bronze Age. It controlled trade between the Mediterranean and the Mesopotamian regions, and wasn't known to absorb influence from other civilizations around it. But around 1200 BC, the Hittite Empire and the capital city of Hattissa disappeared, and the empire was lost to history. When Hattissa was rediscovered in 1834, historians realized that this ancient city and the empire it belonged to was real. But the story of why this once bustling city was abandoned is still waiting to be discovered. It was first settled around the 6th millennium BC. Like any city that was around for so long, it changed hands between various people as civilizations and empires gradually rose and fell. The final and most famous of those civilizations were the Hittites. In around the year 1650 BC, it became the seat of power for the Hittite Empire, and it was during this time period that the city reached its peak. It was a melting pot of different cultures, and home to up to 50,000 people. They were protected by thick walls that surrounded the city. Also part of the city was a large citadel, temples, and the royal residence built on a high ridge. Even though it was well defended, Hattissa would face many battles, including one that forced the Hittite Empire to relocate before one of its successors moved the throne back. The city may have ended in one such battle too. The end of the Hittite Empire is shrouded in mystery. It was one of the many victims of the Bronze Age collapse, which itself is something that puzzled historians and other scholars. Many different causes for the collapse have been put forward, including droughts, a breakdown in trade, and invasions from the mysterious sea people. It's likely that a mixture of different factors caused the ancient Mediterranean civilizations to collapse. While some, such as the ancient Egyptians, managed to continue, the Hittites were wiped from the map. Hattissa, which had been inhabited for centuries, also disappeared. There is evidence that the city was destroyed in a fire, but this wasn't a sudden end to the city. In fact, it had been in decline for a while, before finally being destroyed around 1200 BC. The cause of that decline is a mystery, but there is evidence that the people of the city had been moving out, taking with them their valuables and anything else that they could carry. This coincided with a general decline in the Hittite Empire, and may simply have been a symptom of the wider Bronze Age collapse. It also could have been due to weather conditions or the growth of another currently unknown city in the empire. Research into this ancient civilization is still ongoing, and we might uncover more answers to these mysteries in other cities of the empire. But Hattissa also has some smaller, more perplexing mysteries. Among those is the Wish Stone, a mysterious object that was found in the ruins of an ancient temple. The temple is believed to have been dedicated to the sun goddess and storm god and has been called by archaeologists the Grand Temple. The wish stone was made from nephrite, a dark green in color and roughly cube-shaped stone. The stone is abundant in the region, but no other monuments or monoliths made from it have been discovered. Theories about the purpose of this strange stone range from religious purposes to being used at the base of a statue that's since been destroyed. It could hint at a cultural aspect of the empire that we currently know nothing about. Cryptograms and secret codes are fascinating mysteries, but often the background of these cryptograms and how they originated can be equally fascinating. The Chinese gold bar ciphers are a strange combination of a historical mystery and something that could have a real-world impact today. It also could just be a hoax waiting to be uncovered. The story started when a curator from an unidentified museum brought a collection of 7 gold bars to the International Association of Cryptological Research. The curator explained that the gold bars had been issued to someone named General Wang in China in 1933. They looked similar in appearance to the metal certificates related to a bank deposit in a US bank, and are roughly the size of a remote control. But rather than having clear information about the bank deposit, there is instead a collection of Chinese figures and letters from the Latin alphabet, along with strange images and some form of script writing. The images include that of someone apparently in a military uniform, a plane, and strange symbols. According to the association, the Chinese writing tells of a bank deposit worth roughly $300 million. Little other information was shared, other than images of some of the gold bars. One of the immediate mysteries was who this General Wang was. The name wasn't especially unique, and there were several generals with that name in China during the 1930s. A report from 2005 sheds a little more information about the mysterious bars. According to that report, the General Wang in question was Wang Jiali. Wang Jiali was the chairman of the Guizhou government in the early 1930s, and was known for opposing Chiang Kai-shek's reunification of China. According to the 2005 report on the gold bars, the general bought 300 million shares of Citibank in Shanghai on March 3, 1933 for roughly $1 a share. In 1933, Citibank was known as the National City Bank and did have a branch in Shanghai. That period was a difficult one for the bank, with the head of the bank resigning that same year. The text also allegedly includes the names of the bank officials who were involved in the transaction. There doesn't seem to have been any other record of this transaction, or any explanation for the general's decision to spend money this way. Somehow, these receipts then left China and eventually made their way to the US and into the hands of 2 men in California. It's possible that cracking any of the cryptograms on the gold bars could help solve this strange mystery. It could refute or prove some of this information, or take the story deeper into a rabbit hole. Considering that the moon has been an unchanging companion to Earth throughout human history, there's a lot about this satellite that remains a mystery to us even today. Some of these mysteries we didn't even know existed until relatively recently. One of these is the cause of the near-side-far-side lunar asymmetry. The moon is tidally locked with the Earth. That means that one side of the moon is always facing the Earth, and the other side is always facing away into the darkness of space. For most of human history, only the near side was ever visible to us. The dark blotches on the surface were as familiar a sight to the ancient Mesopotamians as they are to us today. Early astronomers assumed that these dark patches were vast seas that covered 30% of the lunar surface. But as technology developed, they realized that this was actually just a much darker rock, and there was very little liquid water on the moon. The reason for this dark coloration was a mystery, and would remain that way until samples were brought back from the first Apollo missions. But by that time, an even larger mystery had been revealed. In the late 1960s, the first lunar spacecraft orbited the moon and sent back images of the lunar surface. This was the first time humans would get a chance to look at the far side. It was assumed that the far side of the moon would look similar to the near side. What was revealed was completely alien. The far side of the moon has almost none of the dark Maria seen on the near side. Instead, it's littered with craters and resembles the surface of Mercury. The two faces of the moon aren't just completely different, but this difference is split perfectly between the two faces. So while astronauts were collecting the first samples of lunar rock to examine, a new mystery had been uncovered: the cause of this asymmetry. Solving the mystery of the Maria provided at least some explanation. It was always assumed that volcanic and tectonic activity on the moon stopped quickly after it was cooled. It was believed that the moon was too small to retain an internal heating system like the Earth's. But analysis of the rocks collected showed that the moon had been volcanically active just 1 billion years ago, relatively recently in its lifetime. So the explanation for this Maria was volcanic activity. But that didn't explain why one side of the body was covered in these lava flows and the other had very little. It was later revealed that the crust on the far side of the moon is much thicker than the near side. But that couldn't be the only explanation for this volcanic activity. Craters had dug deep into the far side crust, but hadn't resulted in lava pouring onto the surface. Even within these craters, very little Maria can be found. Even if this uneven crust was to explain the lava flows, that wouldn't be the end of the mystery. Scientists have put forward a few different suggestions. Some believe that a random distribution of radioactive elements could be to blame. These elements release heat when they decay into more stable isotopes. They also lower the melting point of the rocks around them, resulting in more magma in this part of the moon. Another theory is a massive collision on the near side, which could have destroyed the crust there. Alternatively, it could be the fault of the Earth itself. During the Earth's early history, it was little more than a ball of magma, which cooled much slower than the moon. But the moon is so close to the Earth that it would have been heated by this ball of boiling rock, which could have resulted in the near side being molten for much longer than the far side. As more missions to the moon are planned for the future, new information could provide us with insights, or just add to the mystery. When Egyptologists explored the tomb of architect Sinmut in 1935, they made a startling and disturbing discovery. Many of his close family members had also been buried in the same tomb. One of these was an unnamed woman whose face was frozen in an expression of fear or pain. Dubbed the Screaming Woman, who she was, how she passed, and why she was embalmed this way are unsolved mysteries. Screaming mummies are a rare phenomenon, but they're not unheard of. The ancient Egyptians had a detailed and careful embalming process, but that wasn't always followed. In some cases, the embalmers didn't secure the jaw shut. As the muscles disintegrate, the jaw falls open, resulting in a haunting expression. At first, it was assumed this is what happened to the Screaming Woman. Senmut was an important architect during the period of Hatshepsut's reign. Anybody who was buried at his tomb would likely have been an important or close family member. His mother was among the people discovered in the same tomb, so it seems unlikely that the Screaming Woman wouldn't have gotten the proper care and treatment. Egyptologists don't know exactly who she was, but she likely had the money and status required for the proper mummification process. But when they looked closer at the mummy, it was clear that the typical process hadn't been followed. During the New Kingdom, mummification required the removal of all internal organs, with the exception of the heart. This mystifying woman was discovered with all of her organs still in her body. For a long time, Egyptologists assumed she must have not been properly cared for after her passing. But more recent analysis has shown that this wasn't the case. Examining her skin revealed that the Screaming Woman was embalmed with juniper and frankincense. These were both very expensive materials and would have had to be imported from outside of Egypt. The fact that her organs were in place wasn't the result of poor mummification, but simply a different process to that which was common at the time. Now, experts have a different idea for the cause of her horrifying expression. The woman may have suffered from a rare event just moments before she passed, which caused all muscles in her face to freeze up. This can occasionally happen when someone is under extreme emotional stress or suffering. It's still debated whether or not these can actually occur, but Egyptologists at Cairo University believe this is exactly what happened to the woman. Her face became frozen just before she passed, and the embalmers were unable to close her jaw. The conclusion was controversial. Some believe that it was simply a case of the jaw not being properly secured, as has been seen elsewhere. The screaming woman underwent various scans at the university to try to solve the mystery of her strange expression. The scans revealed some information about who she was in life. She'd stood a little above 5 feet tall, and an analysis of her bones revealed that she was likely around 48 years of age when she passed. She may have suffered from mild arthritis and recently lost some of her teeth. She was buried wearing a wig of palm fibers treated with quartz and other crystals, and her hair had been dyed with juniper and henna. One thing that the analysis couldn't reveal was just how she passed. This could help to solve the mystery of her anguished expression, but there wasn't enough information for experts to answer this question. In northwestern Spain is a monastery believed to date back to the 6th century and the earliest days of Christianity in the region. It was in this secluded place in the mountainous region of Galicia that a mysterious legend arose. In 2020, a chance discovery proved that the legend was more historical than many believed, but there are still many parts of the story yet to be uncovered. The monastery of Santo Estevão de Ribas de Sil is the setting for this strange mystery. Exactly when it was founded is impossible to determine, but legend states that it was founded by Saint Martin Dumiens, as he brought the religion to the region. It's nestled in the mountains overlooking the Sil River and the relatively untouched countryside. When it was built, it would have been the perfect place for quiet contemplation and meditation. It was in 921 the first documentation of the monastery began, when the king of Galicia authorized its dedication to Saint Stephen. Not long after this, the story of the 9 bishops began. Sometime in the 10th or 12th centuries, 9 high-ranking bishops from different parts of the Iberian Peninsula came to the monastery. They decided to take a vow of poverty, giving up their titles and living the rest of their lives at Santo Estevão de Ribas de Sil. While they were there, they were said to perform miracles or healing, and they were highly regarded by everyone who knew them. When they passed away, the bishops were each buried in the monastery, in a cloister that's now known as the Bishop's Cloister. Their remains were later moved inside the church. But their legend only grew after they passed. The monastery became a pilgrimage destination for people who believed in their miracles, and for those who wanted to see the legendary rings. Even though the bishops had taken a vow of poverty, each retained a ring. These were simple, made from silver with a single gemstone. But after the bishops passed away, it was believed that the rings retained some of their power. They were known to have healing properties, and many came to the monastery in the hope of healing ailments. A small chest containing the rings was even taken to women in labor, in hopes of granting good health to the mother and child. But one of the rings disappeared. There was never any written documentation of this disappearance. No record has ever been found of a theft or some kind of incident that would have resulted in the rings being lost. Many, even those who worked at the monastery, believed that the rings were nothing but a story. Some didn't even believe in the bishops. In 2020, restoration work was underway in the part of the monastery where the remains of the bishops were being kept. It was there that an urn was discovered, and inside there was a silk bag. Inside the bag were 4 rings and a strange note. The note read, quote, "These 4 rings are those that remained of the 9 holy bishops. They are the ones that have remained. The others have disappeared. Water is passed through them for the sick, and many are healed." If the note is to be believed, not only were the 9 rings real, but 4 had been recovered. Authentication work is still ongoing, and the reason why the rings disappeared in the first place is still a mystery. It's possible they were hidden to stop them from being confiscated by authorities or stolen by someone. Another mystery surrounds where the other 5 rings are today. Akhenaten was one of the most controversial pharaohs in ancient Egyptian history, changing the state religion and causing a massive political upheaval that lasted until the reign of his son, King Tut. But between these 2 rulers, at least 2 other pharaohs took the throne. Tut's direct predecessor was a pharaoh named Nefer-Nefertiti, but little else is known about this mysterious figure. The years after Akhenaten's reign were a chaotic time in ancient Egypt. Previously, power had been split between the pharaoh and the priesthood, with the priests of Amun having a lot of power. That power had been removed as Akhenaten barred the worship of gods other than Aten, the sun god. The kingdom had already been unstable while Akhenaten was alive, but when he passed away, that left a power vacuum with no clear successor. Nefer-Neferueten would take the throne, but exactly when is unclear. She may have ruled as a co-regent of Akhenaten, or his successor, Smenkhare. She may have even directly succeeded Akhenaten, with Smenkhare coming after that. The fact that Nefer-Neferueten and Smenkhare shared a name also confused matters, but most Egyptologists believe that the two were separate pharaohs. The reasoning for that is one of the few facts that seems clear about Nefer-Neferueten, that she was a female pharaoh. She was often depicted with female epithets, including one that means effective for her husband. It wouldn't be the first time in ancient Egypt that a female pharaoh had ruled, and given the strange circumstances of the time, a female ruler isn't that hard to believe. But that would rule out her being the same person as Smenkhare. The mummy of Smenkhare has been discovered and confirmed to be that of a young man. But with only one possible identity ruled out, there are still many who Nefer-Neferueten could be. But the mystery of this unknown leader will likely endure for many years to come. In March of 2000, Life magazine announced that it would be stopping publication after over 60 years. Coincidentally, just a few weeks later, a man named George Story, living in Hawaii, passed away due to a heart attack. George's life and that of the magazine were intertwined from the moment he took his first breath to his last. Life magazine actually began as something most people wouldn't recognize today. It was a general interest and humor magazine, very similar to the New Yorker. This format ran from 1883 until 1936, when the magazine was purchased by Time and transformed into a photojournalism publication that would become famous around the world. The first issue of this new Life was released in November. The cover featured the newly built Fort Peck Dam. The editors expected construction photos, but what they got was a slice of life on the western frontier. From that moment on, the publication would be known for its slice of life photography. It covered major news from around the world, but the subjects of the photography weren't only the politicians, celebrities, and major names that influenced events. They included everyday people. Some of the most famous photos and even cover images throughout the Life's run featured everyday people. One of the first ordinary people to feature in Life magazine was George Story. He was born in a hospital in Portland, Oregon. There was nothing any more ordinary about Story's birth, other than the fact that a photojournalist was present in the delivery room. Many pictures were taken that day, including one that would be featured in the first issue of Life magazine, published shortly after Story's birth. The picture showed him being held and cleaned by a doctor, shortly after his umbilical cord was cut. The caption beneath the photo painted a picture of the first moments of his life, of being between two worlds for a moment, living and breathing, but still attached to his mother. It was titled Life Begins, and began, the camera records the most vital moment in any life, its beginning. Despite featuring in a magazine that would be read by millions of people, George lived a very private life. But throughout that life, the Life magazine would visit him, taking photos and keeping readers up to date on what was going on. It was a slice of life in every sense of the term. George grew up, got married, and had children. He had a career as a journalist before becoming a city manager. Each update included a new photo of George. Life was an expensive magazine to produce. When it first started, handheld photography was still a novelty, and there was nothing like the photojournalism of photo essays that Life became known for. But over time, that changed, and Life became less attractive to readers. It went on hiatus for several years before returning in 1978 for monthly issues. The updates in George's life continued. But in 2000, printing the magazine became too expensive, and Life stopped publication for good. It became online only, and eventually only special editions were published. The plan for the final issue included another visit to George Story, who by this time was in his 60s. But just weeks after Time announced Life would be stopping, George passed away. His passing was just days before the interview was supposed to take place. He would still feature in the magazine, this time in an article under the headline, Life Ends, a fitting finale for the magazine. The First World War changed the trajectory of Europe, and much of the rest of the world for the rest of the 20th century. While the tensions on the continent may have made it seem like some kind of war was inevitable, the sparks that actually ignited the conflict were actually more like coincidences than certainties. Most people know of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Habsburg throne, as the event that triggered the entire war. It's also a common anecdote in popular history that it was only chance that put the Archduke in the wrong place at the wrong time. But even with this strange coincidence and the tragic demise of the Archduke and his wife, there would still have been a chance that the war would not go ahead, were it not for other coincidences that took place. One of these was the untimely passing of Nicholas Hartwig. Hartwig was the Russian ambassador to Serbia and had been an important political figure in the region for years. He was born in Georgia to a minor noble family of German descent. After graduating from St. Petersburg Imperial University, he joined the Russian Foreign Office and spent much of his career in the Asiatic department. But Hartwig's real interest lay in the Balkans, in particular with Serbia. A series of wars in the region had left countries battling for power in regions that had once been part of the Ottoman Empire. Even though they were collectively known as the South Slavs and had a lot in common, the different people had their own distinct cultures and identities, even if the nationalities didn't reflect that. The situation in the region was complicated, and made even more complicated by the involvement of Russia and Austria-Hungary. Serbia was just one of the nations that had risen into the Balkans and had grown in strength during the wars. The nation was eyeing territory that belonged to others, in particular Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bosnia was part of the Austrian Empire at the time, so it seemed inevitable that there would be some conflict between the two nations. Hartwig was described as more Serbian than Serbs, and supported Serbia's interests in the region. A lot has been written about his qualities as an ambassador. Many seem to think that he promoted himself as having more power than he actually did, and gave the impression that his personal opinions were Russian policy. He also may not have had accurately reported back public sentiment in Serbia to Russia. Hartwig, being in this position at such an important moment in history, definitely had an impact on how various politicians thought of the other nations involved in the crisis. Despite his pro-Serbian sentiments, Hartwig may not have been as enthusiastic about a war starting as it might have first seemed. His Austrian counterpart, Baron von Geisel, seemed to believe that Hartwig would have advised the Serbian government to accept the ultimatum that Austria presented them with. This may have been just wishful thinking on von Geisel's part, but on July 10, 1914, the two men met in Belgrade. They then had what was described as a friendly conversation. Hartwig seemed to have been trying to smooth over tensions caused by the Russian reaction to the news of Franz Ferdinand's passing. They did not share food, but Hartwig did smoke some cigarettes, and then suddenly at the end of the meeting he suffered a heart attack. Hartwig had been having heart problems for a while, but that didn't stop rumors from spreading. His own daughter believed he may have been poisoned and collected the cigarette butts as evidence. Rumors appeared in the newspapers that the Austrian ambassador had been responsible for Hartwig's passing, which only further stoked tensions. Even if Hartwig hadn't intended to stop the war, his passing at that coincidental time definitely made war seem more inevitable than it would have been if he had not passed. It also meant that Russia didn't have an ambassador to Serbia at this crucial time, which would only have made a diplomatic solution to the crisis even less likely. In 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright became the first people to demonstrate engine-powered heavier-than-air flight. Less than 70 years later, Neil Armstrong became the first human to set foot on the moon. Not only did the three men become inspirational figures in the field of aeronautics, but their journeys all began in Ohio, as did a surprising number of others in the field. The Wright brothers' first flight did not take place in Ohio. The 12-second journey occurred in North Carolina, but it was in Ohio where their plans to take to the sky began. The brothers owned a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, and had moderate success. But by 1899, Wilbur had become fascinated with the idea of heavier-than-air flight, and work on the first Wright plane began. The Wrights revolutionized not only flight, but also aeronautical research. Techniques they used at the turn of the 20th century, such as wind tunnels, are still used today. They started out with a simple kite and glider, developing the wing shapes and just how a pilot was able to manipulate them. Finally, in 1903, they added propulsion and a propeller to create what's considered the first airplane. While testing and original flights took place in North Carolina, it wasn't long before their base of operations moved to Ohio. A banker allowed them to use his pasture not far from Dayton as an airfield. An airship was built there, and it was gradually developed into what can be called the world's first airport. Huffman Field also became home to a flight school, and later Dayton became home to the first airplane factory. Here, the Wright brothers produced parts and planes that would be shipped around the world. Over the next decades, the plane developed a lot, with many inventors around the world contributing to that development. But it seems that the people of Ohio never stopped looking up. By the 1960s, the space race was well underway, and the recently founded National Aeronautics and Space Administration was tasked with beating the Soviet Space Agency. In 1969, the Soviet Union put the first human in space, but the US and Ohio would soon catch up. John Glenn was born in Cambridge, Ohio. During the Second World War, he joined the US Army Corps and became a respected fighter pilot. This put him in the perfect position when NASA started to look for candidates to go even further away from the Earth's surface. Glenn was one of 7 military test pilots picked for NASA's first crop of astronauts. In 1962, he became the first American to orbit the Earth. Ohio would continue to produce astronauts at a surprising rate. Even though the state only has 3% of the US population, 25 astronauts have called the state their home. The state is the 4th highest producer of astronauts in the US, and is beaten only by the much more populated states of California, Texas, and New York. Among the Ohio natives who've gone to space is the most famous astronaut, Neil Armstrong. In some ways, it's only a coincidence that so many people from Ohio have chosen flight and spaceflight as their careers. But there may be more tangible reasons that this is the case. Some have suggested that the past success of famous Ohio residents has inspired future ones to follow in their footsteps. Others have pointed out that Ohio has become a center of aeronautical technology, which has inevitably drawn in locals. Whatever the case, it seems unlikely that Ohio's close friendship with flight will end anytime soon. French wartime leader General Charles de Gaulle survived at least 30 attempts on his life during his life, both during and after the war. Many of these were thwarted by simply ducking for cover, or events not going ahead as planned. But there was one attempt that's been described as a miracle, extremely lucky, or just a very strange coincidence. August 26, 1944, was supposed to be a day of celebration in Paris. 10 days earlier, the insurrection had begun. It was led by members of France's Communist Party, working with resistance members in the occupied capital. Even though they didn't have the firepower, the resistance decided it was time to strike against the occupying army. Originally, there weren't plans for the Allied forces to take Paris, but rather go straight to Berlin. It seemed unlikely that the Germans would let the city go without a fight, but it didn't hold much strategic importance. But the man in charge of the defense for the city, General Dietrich von Choltitz, didn't want to see the city destroyed and negotiated for a peaceful handing over of the city. On top of that, de Gaulle was eager for French forces under his command to be involved in the liberation of the city. Starting on the night of August 24th, French soldiers, led by Major General Leclerc, moved into the city. By the afternoon of the following day, von Choltitz had surrendered. Celebrations took place throughout the city that day, but there were plans for something more formal the following day. De Gaulle wanted to be seen and for his role in the liberation to be known. Even while there were still pockets of German resistance both in the city and in France as a whole, people were working to think about what would happen afterwards. The Communist Party had started the push, and it would be easy for them to claim the victory as their own. De Gaulle knew if that happened, it would have made the fight after the war even more difficult. A parade was planned, which would place a wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier there. He would then go down to the Cathedral of Notre Dame for a Te Deum Thanksgiving. The journey was planned out in detail, and the streets were packed with citizens wanting to catch a glimpse of the famous general. All along the route, there were military personnel and police officers ready in case disaster struck. That seemed to happen at around 4 p.m., shortly after de Gaulle arrived at Notre Dame. While he was still outside, bullets were fired from the roof of a nearby building. They were quickly met with a return volley from the military presence, and the crowds rushed for cover or to get away. De Gaulle didn't do the same. He simply walked calmly into the cathedral where the attack continued. There were more attackers hiding within the cathedral itself. Some reported bullets coming from the upper gallery near the grand organ. It would have been a location where they had a clear view of de Gaulle and other important political figures that had gathered. For about 10 minutes, the attack continued, but de Gaulle carried on as if nothing was happening. He made no effort to duck for cover, and reporters at the scene described it as a miracle that he wasn't hit. The only change of plans was to make the service very short, after which he went straight to the Ministry of War. Who exactly was behind the attack was never determined for certain. Some blamed German holdouts, while others thought it was members of the Communist Party, hoping to take out a political opposition. Another theory is that the mass panic was simply caused by people being on edge and misinterpreting celebrations as an attack. Whatever the case, de Gaulle's survival and defiance had a lasting impact on France for decades to come. It's no coincidence that George Orwell took inspiration from his time in the Spanish Civil War when writing his most famous works. But an eerie coincidence that even he was unaware of surrounded one of his most infamous villains. In 1936, a civil war gripped Spain. The fighting largely took place between forces led by Francisco Franco and the Republic, who had the backing of the Soviet Union. Orwell was a socialist, something that had already drawn the attention of the police in the UK. He followed the events in Spain closely and decided to travel there to fight on the side of the Republic. This wasn't one unified group though, and Orwell wasn't entirely familiar with the political differences between them. He eventually ended up joining the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, or the POUM, which had links to the Independent Labour Party in the UK. This was a choice that would have a terrifying impact on Orwell's life. The fighting in Spain was terrible, and Orwell was wounded in the throat while on the front lines. But the fighting between the communist factions was almost even more dangerous to the future writer. High-ranking officials in the POUM had connections to the famous Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky. By this point, Trotsky was living in exile, having been ejected from the Soviet Union. But the government in the USSR still believed he posed a threat, as did any of his supporters. Members of the POUM were labeled as Trotskyists. That included Orwell, his wife, and their close friends. The Soviet secret services, the NKVD, had spies operating in Spain, trying to find out as much information about the people who they'd been fighting alongside. One of these spies was David Crook, another British citizen who'd gone to Spain to fight on behalf of the Republic. Crook earned a job in the office of the ILP, where he used the long Spanish lunch breaks to take photographs of all the files and send them to the Soviets. Of particular focus for him was Orwell and his wife, although it doesn't seem that he gained a lot of information about them. Orwell's file is still under wraps in the Russian archives. Only a few details have ever been revealed. One of these was that Crook was 95% certain Orwell's wife was having an affair. Another detail, which was only revealed in 2003, was that Crook's spy master was Hugh O'Donnell, who went by the codename O'Brien. Anybody who's read Orwell's 1984 would recognize O'Brien as the name of the main antagonist. In the book, O'Brien befriends the main characters, Winston and Julia, in a similar way to how Crook had gotten close to the Orwells. He convinced them he was part of a resistance group, only to turn on them and reveal that he's actually locating traitors to the party. Orwell was likely aware that he was being spied on. Many of his friends were thrown in prison, and he made a narrow escape. But it's unknown if he actually knew Crook was the spy, and it's unlikely that he knew the person behind the spying was codenamed O'Brien. One of the most famous strange coincidences in pop culture may not have had a lasting impact on history or society, but it's remained in the public consciousness for decades. Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon is one of the most popular albums in history. It was released in 1973 and has since appeared on many lists of the greatest albums of all time. It also holds the record for the most weeks on the Billboard Top 200 chart. Another extremely popular piece of media is the 1939 musical film The Wizard of Oz. The movie took advantage of the new Technicolor film to introduce audiences to the psychedelic world of Oz and the strange story of a girl from Kansas in this unusual land. There was little reason to connect the album and the movie, and for decades, nobody thought to. But in the mid-1990s, rumors began to be shared on the internet forums dedicated to discussing Pink Floyd. Nobody knew exactly who had noticed the strange coincidences first. The first time it reached the popular press was in an article in the Journal-Gazette in Fort Wayne, Indiana. According to the writer, the information had come to him second or third hand through the Usenet group, and may have originated somewhere in California. If the Dark Side of the Moon album was played alongside The Wizard of Oz, the music seemed to line up with the visuals and mood of the film. The general consensus is to start the album at the third roar of the MGM lion. The synchronicities start almost immediately. The small coincidences begin with lines from songs lining up to small events in the movie. The words "balanced on the biggest wave" play as Dorothy balances on a fence, and the lyrics "no one told you where to run" come as Dorothy starts to run home. But the coincidences then become even more eerie, as the song "The Great Gig in the Sky" seems to line up perfectly with the tornado scene, as Dorothy's home is torn from the ground. Other synchronicities include the Wicked Witch of the West confronting Dorothy, as the lyrics "Black and Blue" are sung, and the sound of a faint heartbeat playing as Dorothy listens for a heartbeat in the Tin Man's chest. The band has been asked about these strange coincidences many times, and each time they've denied it was intentional. It seems most likely that these synchronicities are just coincidences. When the album was being written, the band wouldn't have had access to VHS tapes of the movie, which would have made making something to synchronize to it almost impossible. The fact that the album only covers the first half of the movie also seems to indicate that they weren't made to go together. The writer, who wrote the first article on the topic, pointed out that it was unlikely that Pink Floyd would have kept the gimmick a secret for so long when it would take a strange coincidence for anybody to have figured this out by themselves. The apparent synchronicity is likely a case of our minds trying to find patterns from random things, and attempting to connect audio and visual inputs. There are many other instances where people have suggested music in films or even episodes of cartoons that seem to match up. The fact that The Dark Side of the Moon and The Wizard of Oz are both somewhat experimental and were extremely popular at the same time likely helped this match to catch people's attention. Grigory Rasputin was a controversial figure who seemed to have a supernatural grip on Russia in 1914. 64 years later, a song almost as controversial as The Mystic rose in the charts across Europe and was an underground success in the Soviet Union. In a strange coincidence, Rasputin and the man who performed the song about him met their ends in the same city on the same day. It's thanks in part to the song by the band Bunny M that Rasputin is so well known today. Rasputin was a Russian mystic and faith healer who rose to prominence at the start of the 20th century. Not much is known about his early life. He was born a peasant and dedicated his life to holy work when he was 28. This started as simple pilgrims, but his personality gradually changed to something much more eccentric. He gathered followers as a holy wanderer in Serbia and Russia, gaining followers through his charisma and supposed healing powers. Mysticism, spiritualism, and the occult have been gaining popularity among the aristocratic classes in Russia. Rasputin stood out due to how strange he acted. Eventually, in 1905, Rasputin was introduced to the Russian imperial family. Tsar Nicholas II had 5 children, but only one son, Alexei. Unfortunately, Alexei suffered from hemophilia. It meant that even a small wound could cost Alexei his life. The royal family wanted to keep his condition a secret, but they were desperate for a cure. Attempting to keep Alexei out of danger didn't work, and in the autumn of 1907, a fall that wounded Alexei's leg left him in serious condition. Rasputin was called in at this point to pray over him. What he did is unclear, but it seemed to work, and Alexei's condition improved. From that point onwards, he became an important figure to the Russian family. As Alexei's condition was a secret, there were rumors about what the strange disheveled man was doing in the palace. Some of those rumors suggested that Rasputin was actually in control of the royal family and had more political power than a typical healer should have had. The rumors became even worse during World War I, when Nicholas left Russia to command his troops. It all led to a conspiracy in which Russian nobles and political figures decided they needed to take out Rasputin. There was a belief that with his influence removed, the royal family could regain some of the control and dignity that it had lost. The famous story surrounding Rasputin's passing is likely exaggerated, and nobody knows for sure what happened. According to Prince Yusupov, Rasputin was invited into his home and fed cakes and wine laced with toxins. When these failed to take him out, Yusupov produced a weapon and struck Rasputin with 3 bullets, which finally proved successful. Rasputin passed away in the early morning hours of December 30th, 1914. 60 years later, the Eurodance band Boney M was founded in West Germany. Bobby Farrell was the frontman. He was a dancer and a DJ from Aruba. Farrell wasn't a singer, but would lip-sing along to the male parts of the band's songs. His stage presence was a huge selling point for the band, though, and helped their music to catch on. In 1978, the band's songwriter and producer, Frank Farian, penned his most infamous song. Rasputin told the story of the Russian mystic, along with many of the rumors that surrounded him. Famously, this included that he was Alexandria's lover, something there wasn't much evidence for. The song became a hit in Europe and even in the Soviet Union. The band were invited to perform in Russia in December of 1978, but were under strict instructions not to perform Rasputin. The following year, the band performed the song in Poland. Bobby Farrell had a short but successful career with Boney M, but separated from the band for good in 1988. After that, he lived a relatively quiet life in Amsterdam, but continued to perform. In December of 2010, he traveled to St. Petersburg to perform with his new band. On the morning of December 30th, hotel staff discovered he'd passed away from natural causes in the night. It was not only the anniversary of Rasputin's passing, but the very same city where the mystic had met his end. Every year, NFL fans eagerly await to find out which star player will be on the cover of the sport's popular video game, Madden, and potentially to find out which player will be cursed for the upcoming season. But like all curses, the so-called Madden curse is nothing more than an eerie coincidence. It started in 1998, the first time that a player was featured on the cover of a video game. Before that, the star of the cover was John Madden, the coach and commentator. Madden still featured on the North American version of the cover, but elsewhere, Garrison Hearst was the star. It was with Hearst that the curse began. In the years before he was featured on the video game cover, Hearst had become a star of the game, setting records for rushing yards in a season, and in a single game, and completing what's been called one of the best running plays in the sport's history. But in January of 1999, during the playoffs, Hearst suffered a break to his ankle that kept him off the field for 2 years. Despite being told that he might never play again, Hearst did recover to play for 4 more seasons. If it had only been Hearst, this might have been a strange coincidence that nobody noticed. But a few years later, the curse struck again. Madden 2002 featured Dante Culpepper as the cover star. Culpepper had quickly stood out as a talented player, but his luck started around the time that he was featured on the video game cover. His performances were already not matching what he had previously achieved when he damaged his knee, which ruled him out of 5 games. It wasn't nearly as severe as what had happened to Hearst, and it's possible people wouldn't have made the connection if similar fates didn't continue to befall players. The cover stars in the next 5 years all had accidents that would take them off the field for multiple games. Many also suffered a general downturn in performance. By the time Madden 2008 was planned, fans had started to take notice. The legend of the Madden curse had been born. Fans of the San Diego Chargers set up a website to lobby Electronic Arts to stop their favorite players from appearing on the cover. Even though the EA marketing team insisted there was no curse, the star for Madden 08, Vince Young, had a bad year and fell out of the favor of his coach. The so-called curse continued for a few more years, but by the mid-2010s it seemed like the downturn in luck that players had been seeing was no longer occurring. Who exactly is classed as cursed differs from fan to fan. Some only class those who were taken out of multiple games as cursed, while others would say anybody who lost performance as having fallen victim to the video game's power. But most agree that by the latter half of the 2010s, neither of those things were happening at a significant rate to any of the cover stars. Players are more skeptical of the curse. NFL is a very physical sport, and every year players miss games due to incidents. There doesn't seem to be a higher rate of incidents for those on the cover than anybody else. One player put it simply, do you want to be hurt and on the cover, or just hurt? In the summer of 1004, astronomers across Asia recorded a strange new star that was visible even in the daytime. This guest star was a supernova, which in the almost 1,000 years since it burst into life has transformed into the Crab Nebula. Coincidentally, in Europe at the same time, another event that would change society on the continent was taking place. The two events coinciding may have had a lasting impact on astronomical records in the region. 1054 was still a period of the so-called Dark Ages in Europe, but that doesn't mean there was no interest in science or astronomy. In fact, things such as a supernova in 1006 and Halley's Comet in 1066 were recorded. At the time, there was a belief that the stars could show signs or omens, so recording changes would have been significant. And in April of 1054, some in Europe made note of a strange new object in the night sky. It was described as a bright light or a fiery pillar. This coincided with the passing of Pope Leo IX and may have been used as a sign of his holy status. Today, we know that this fiery pillar was actually a supernova erupting into life. An ancient star had run out of fuel and collapsed in on itself before sending matter out into space. It would eventually turn into the Crab Nebula, which was first observed by comparatively modern astronomers in 1731. The nebula is located 6,500 light-years from Earth and is roughly 11 light-years across. After a few weeks, the supernova disappeared behind the sun and was no longer visible. The focus of Europe turned away from the heavens to the Earth. The fractures between the Church in Rome and the Church in Constantinople had been growing for a while, but the official date of what is called the Great Schism was July 16, 1054, when representatives from the Church in Rome excommunicated those from the Constantinople Church. By this time, the supernova had emerged from behind the sun. It was in around July that astronomers in China, Japan, and Constantinople made the most reports about what they believed to be a new star. For a month, it could be seen during the day, and for years afterwards, it would have been visible without any special equipment at night. But there is a surprising lack of any notes about the astronomical event in Europe. Some believe that the Church would have seen the strange cosmological event as some kind of sign. At the very least, they would have been aware of the fact that it could be interpreted that way by ordinary people. Scholars believe that reports of the strange astronomical sightings were suppressed so that nobody got the impression that the Great Schism was actually something significant. Alternatively, around the same time, there was a volcanic eruption in Iceland. Some have suggested that ash and dust from this eruption had obscured the view in Europe. It seems unlikely this was the case, but it is still a possibility. Without any documents from the era, it's impossible to say for certain why this strange coincidence wasn't noticed by the European scholars. In 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, sailed across the English Channel to lay claim to the throne of England. What followed was a dash across the country for the defending king, Harold Godwinson, and a close battle fought on a new site known as Battle. William took the victory and changed the course of English history forever. But if a strange coincidence hadn't taken place, it's possible things would have been very different. On January 5th, 1066, Edward the Confessor passed away. He had ruled as King of England for roughly 24 years, taking over the throne of Harthacnut. He didn't have any children, but in his later life, he's believed to have promised the throne to at least two people. The first was Harold Godwinson, a duke who'd been instrumental in Edward taking the crown. The second was William of Normandy. William's father was Edward's cousin, making him one of Edward's closest living relatives. But while these would become the last two claimants to the throne, and the two most famous, they weren't the only ones. Harold's brother, Tostig, also believed he had claim to the throne. Tostig had already been deposed from his position as Earl of Northumbria due to a revolt by the locals there. He fled to Norway, where he met with the king Harald Hardrada. Hardrada believed he also had claim to the throne. Edward's predecessor Harthacnut had allegedly promised the throne to the king of Norway. This was before Hardrada had taken the throne there, but he reasoned that the claim had passed on to him when he'd risen to power at home. Tostig also played a role in convincing Hardrada to pursue his claim. As the only claimant actually in England, Harold Godwinson had quickly had himself crowned. He was aware of William's claim to the throne and prepared for an invasion from Normandy, but storms in the English Channel delayed William's departure. Before William could leave France, Godwinson received news that a Viking army had landed in the north of England. Hardrada's army consisted of thousands of troops on hundreds of long ships. The local nobles were little match to them, and the Vikings spent some weeks raiding northern England for supplies. Word reached Godwinson, who marched his army to Yorkshire to meet with the invaders. The battle would become known as the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Despite the harsh march and fierce fighting from Hardrada, Godwinson's army emerged victorious. But coincidentally in the south, the weather had changed. 2 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, William's forces arrived in England and were now preparing to do battle. Another long march across the country took place. By the time Godwinson's army met with the Norman invasion force, they were exhausted from 2 trips and a fiercely fought battle. The Battle of Hastings is one of the most well-recorded fights in medieval history. It was also one of the most closely matched. Both sides had thousands of men between them. Godwinson's army had the higher ground, but the Normans had both cavalry and the superior tactics. It took multiple attempts, but a fake retreat eventually convinced the English forces to break ranks, and the Normans were able to come through. The fighting took most of the day, lasting roughly 9 hours, but Godwinson eventually lost his life and the rest of the army was defeated. Given how evenly matched they were, it seems very likely that things could have gone differently if Godwinson's army had not been so battle-worn by the time the fighting started. If the weather had allowed for Williamson to sail earlier, as he had intended, or if the Hardrada had never pressed his claim, it's possible that the Norman invasion would have been a failure. The chance changed history forever. The FIFA World Cup refers to the International Association football competition. With every competitive sport, a prize is needed. This is where the Jules Rimet trophy was born. It was named after the man who designed it and constructed it from gold-plated sterling silver, mounted on a lapis lazuli base. Rimet based the trophy's design on a statue at the Louvre Museum, the figure of Nike, the Greek goddess of victory. The cup weighed just over 8 pounds and stood at a height of 3.7 inches tall. In 1970, Brazil won its 3rd World Cup tournament, and as a result, they were allowed to keep the original Jules Rimet gold trophy. Ever since, the FIFA teams have been competing for an alternative trophy. But the original cup has a history of frustrating disappearances. It began in 1966, just 4 months before the English tournament. It was on display at the Westminster Central Hall from which it was stolen. There were supposed to be 2 guards on duty, but on this day they failed to attend to their duties. 3 days later, the Football Association received a ransom note, but it turned out to be a setup. Incredibly though, just a week after it was stolen, the trophy was discovered by an unlikely candidate, Pickles, a collie puppy. Pickles alerted his owner, David Corbett, to a newspaper-wrapped item that was lying in a bush near the home in South London, but conflicting sources indicate that it was found beneath a car. Upon unwrapping it, he discovered the missing cup and turned it in. He was awarded a lifetime supply of dog food, a silver medal from the National Canine Defense League, and an invitation to the England team's celebratory banquet. 1 year later, Pickles passed on, and his collar was displayed at the National Football Museum. In 1970, Mexico hosted the World Cup, where the winning team, Brazil, would somehow lose the top of the trophy, which they were later able to retrieve from a young spectator. But in 1983, the Jules Rimet Cup's luck of retrieval would finally run out. It had been 17 years since the theft in England, and at this time it was being kept in a cabinet at the Brazilian football headquarters in Rio de Janeiro. Thieves broke into the headquarters and the prized cabinet using a crowbar. Despite extensive efforts, the trophy remained missing and has never been found since. It disappeared into a world of speculation. There have been various theories that have since come about regarding the eventual fate of the Golden Cup, none of which can be proven. It's guessed that the thieves sold it off and it was melted down into gold bars by whoever bought it. The flaw in this theory, though, is that the trophy itself was not made of solid gold, but was plated on sterling silver. Melting the object down and creating bars from it was deemed improbable. A banker and football agent, Sergio Peralta, was named the mastermind behind this theft. It was said that he hired an ex-policeman named Chico Barbudo and a decorator, Luis Bigode, to aid in stealing the item. Together, the three went ahead with their plan and stole the jewels Rame, as well as another 2 trophies. The band of thieves were later arrested but fled to Brazil while their sentences were being handed to them. According to some reports, 2 of the criminals met their demise some years later, leaving the location of the valuable cup an enduring mystery. The Marine Sulphur Queen was a 504-foot T2 tanker that was operated as a workhorse after the Second World War. It was built in 1944 and was later sold off as an oiler. In 1960, the MSQ was repurposed and converted to carry molten sulfur. This required its bowls to be redone, and a 306-foot-long welded steel tank was placed down the center. Its purpose was to hold and maintain the sulfur in a molten condition. During the conversion, the ship was extensively overhauled. The MSQ carried out the sulfur trade for 2 years without incident. Former crewmen noted that the ship was, in fact, a fire trap, though. They testified that the vessel had regular leaks that occurred in the spaces beneath, which would lead to regular fires on board. Over the last century, we've been bombarded with the disappearance of aircraft and ships, which seemed to vanish into thin air, never to be seen again. The MSQ was one such ship. The disappearance also centered around the legend of the Bermuda Triangle, for which the vessel would become the star. It was 1963 when the Marine Sulphur Queen was due to make its trip from Beaumont, Texas to Norfolk, Virginia. The 15,000-tonner was due to arrive at the destination on the 2nd of February that year, but it never made it there. There were no weather reports claiming that the vessel set sail in poor weather conditions, and no distress signals were passed. The ship, along with the 39 crewmen on board, was declared missing. The last radio report of the vessel placed it 230 miles southeast of New Orleans. Soon after, speculations about the ship's fate abounded. Some theorized that the MSQ was a victim of piracy or sabotage. It's also thought that the vessel somehow found its way off course. This is due to the fact that despite an extensive search effort carried out by the U.S. Coast Guard of the route, the wreckage or the crew were never found. This left the Marine Sulphur Queen's disappearance as yet another unsolved and enduring mystery that would haunt the ocean for decades. 2 weeks following the initial vanishing, a broken oar, pieces of a raft, a signboard, and a life vest washed up on Florida beaches. There had been no SOS and no warning of trouble. After this, more former crewmen began to speak out about the dangers that this particular vessel posed to those on board. Now, many wonder if the Queen didn't just fall apart following an out-of-control fire. In the years that followed, speculation grew on the idea that the ship was another victim of the triangular wormhole of the Atlantic Ocean. Some design engineers argue otherwise, pointing to all of the design issues, and the vessel has been deemed a piece of garbage that could float by a missing crew member's wife. The ship undoubtedly sank somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico, but the exact area is still the subject of lore that has since emerged regarding the missing vessel and its enigmatic vanishing. The story of James Durham is a very little-known fact about African American history. While accounts may vary, some historians place his birth somewhere around 1762, the era of slavery. But Durham's life would take an unexpected turn as he grew older. At the age of 8, he was bought by a physician named John A. Kearsley Jr., who made him into an apprentice at his home in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where other doctors resided. He was also taught to read, write, and speak various languages. Dr. Kearsley even taught him to compound medications and to perform surgical care. When he reached the age of 21, Durham was sold to a doctor who lived in New Orleans. This doctor mentored the man and even allowed him to work with patients, which was a first, according to documented history. In the early 1780s, Durham purchased his freedom. The New Orleans doctor encouraged him to continue his practice and hone his skills in treating throat ailments. By this time, he was already fluent in French, English, and Spanish. In 1788, he returned to Philadelphia, likely to visit family there. The man's prowess in medicine and his treatment of yellow fever grabbed the attention of Benjamin Rush, the father of modern medicine, and an active member of the abolitionist movement. He encouraged the aspiring doctor to return to stay in Philadelphia and open a practice there. Dr. Rush had even written a letter to the Society for the Abolishment of Slavery, stating how incredible this new doctor was. The two corresponded for another 12 years after that. It was documented in 1789, when Durham was around 26 years old, that he was making somewhere in the vicinity of $3,000 a year, equivalent to just over $76,000 today. By 1801, a new regulation had been introduced into the city. The regulation prevented anyone without a medical degree from practicing medicine and medical care. The doctor, though, was permitted to treat people for throat ailments. In 1801, it was found that he was still in New Orleans, where he wrote to Dr. Rush. His letter had detailed a case that he and the doctor he met in New Orleans were treating, one that involved cowpox. This posited the idea that he was practicing under his mentor's name for cases that were not related to illness of the throat. It was noted that he also mentioned other possibilities, and where else he would be able to practice medicine if he were to flee from the city. Then, in 1802, all correspondence ceased. Dr. Durham disappeared, never to be seen again. Some believe that he was struck down due to his success, which was frowned upon at the time, but others held out the hope that he fled Philadelphia in an effort to practice medicine elsewhere in the world. For some time, he would practice secrecy until his disappearance. His name was never mentioned again in historical records, and his fate remains uncertain. To know whether he established a practice elsewhere under another's name, or if he met his demise, will forever be an enduring mystery. Not much is known about the doctor's disappearance, and that may have been exactly how he wanted it. After 1802, Durham's life was left up to speculation, and perhaps he never truly stopped corresponding with Rush, who could have even advised him to retreat underground, use a pseudonym, or practice under another doctor. We'll just never know. James Durham is noted as being the very first African-American physician ever in the history of the United States. Flor de la Mar was a sailing ship built in 1502 with a length of 118 feet. It served as the Portuguese fleet's flagship in the Indian Ocean and participated in many colonial campaigns over its 9 years of service. It was the most impressive ship at the time and was twice the size of any predecessor that traveled the fleets. In 1511, this 400-tonner was commanded by Alfonso de Albuquerque, the legendary general, admiral, and statesman. That year, Flor de la Mar had supported the conquests of Goa and Malacca, but this, though, would be the ship's final venture. Laden with the riches of war from the royal palace belonging to the Sultan of Malacca, the ship never reached home again. The ship and her large cargo of treasure sank somewhere off the coast of Sumatra in November, where it remains lost. No wreckage was ever discovered, and no indication of its existence after that resurfaced. The hoard of treasure lies undiscovered at the bottom of the sea. Throughout the ship's operation, it underwent a slew of repairs and was deemed barely seaworthy. Just before the vessel set sail on its final voyage, the crew were said to be incredibly reluctant to board it. The route back home took the ship around the northeastern coast of Sumatra, where it's believed to have been caught in a storm. It's believed that the crew steered Flor de la Mar to the coast to seek refuge, but was breached. The storm was so severe that the vessel crashed into shoals, split in two halves, and sank to the bottom of the ocean on the evening of the 20th of November, 1511. Alfonso and a few others made it out, but the ship and the treasure aboard were gone. Among the vast riches of Malacca were 60 tons of gold and 200 gem chests filled with diamonds, emeralds, and rubies. This made it the largest mass ever accumulated by the Portuguese Navy. The missing vessel is said to be worth something like £2.5 billion today. Strangely though, despite being a large ship laden with many treasures and around 400 crew members, Flor de la Mar has never been found. Making it even more mysterious is the fact that it sank in shallow waters. A likely scenario for its disappearance in these waters would be the sea carrying it out and burying it beneath sediment. The legend of the missing mass and treasure hadn't gone without interest of treasure hunters. In 1992, Bob Marks thought that he'd found the wreck site after 3 days of searching, but the project was shut down. Then 18 years went by, and everyone had forgotten about the Flor de la Mar. That was until an explorer, author and photographer named Rick Langer found a silver Tonka coin in northern Sumatra. While this sparked excitement in treasure hunters, the find was ultimately deemed inconclusive, and so the search for the missing ship continues. The Native American Inca have a rich and colorful history. Historians believe that they arrived in the valley around 1100, where they would go on to build their capital city, Cusco. Their bodies were adorned with golden jewelry and vibrant ponchos. The area proved to be a difficult place to live where the rain didn't fall too often. During their occupancy, the Inca would conquer the nearby tribes and have more power, after which they took control of the Cusco Valley just a few hundred years later. For years, the tribe also mined gold and silver from the Andes Mountains, which they would later make into jewelry and art. The reign of this artistic civilization, though, was brought to an end during the Spanish conquest. By 1572, the last Inca state was conquered. As the years passed on and the modern era began to unearth the past lives of historical societies, questions about the Incas began to arise. They found themselves at the center of the most enduring mysteries. This society didn't establish a written language, which made it more difficult to understand the era. Historians agree that there's something mystical and almost alien-like about Inca history. One of the enduring mysteries circles around the lost Inca treasures in the lost city of gold. According to the legend, it all began in the 16th century, when the Inca Empire was giving way to invaders. The Inca king was captured by a Spanish commander named Francisco Pizarro. He agreed to release the king if he was given a roomful of gold. Before the last and largest part of the ransom deal could be delivered, the Spaniards reneged on the deal, and so the riches were buried in a mountain cave that's been kept secret ever since. One guide who paved the way for the treasure hunters was Valverde, who became unexpectedly rich 50 years later, when he was led to the gold by his Incan bride's family. Upon his passing, Valverde wrote the directions to the secret location. The gold trail went cold and was left undiscovered. Then, in 1850, an English botanist claimed to have found the map made by Valverde. In 1886, another treasure hunter, Barth Blake, followed up on the discovery, and if his writing is to be believed, he was the last person ever to have found the riches. This is the most well-known legend involving the Incas, but there is another that speaks of the lost city of gold, Paititi. The legend states that the ancient civilization hid their rice from the Europeans in this city instead. The location of this place, however, remains unknown and is synonymous with the legend of El Dorado. Many have tried and failed to find Paititi. Many believe that it's located in an area of the Amazon that hadn't been discovered yet. Many of the journeys to find the place were inspired by the writings of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and The Lost World. Treasure hunters, explorers, and archaeologists have all documented their quests to find the lost city, but still it remains subject of a tribal legend. But a secluded area in the Peruvian Amazon has now been found. Many believe that this really is a legendary city. The Inca civilization has spoken about a city that lay deep within the jungle and east of the Andes area of Cusco. Could this place be really where they hid their riches? Was the story of burying the gold in the caves just told to throw off the treasure hunters? These are the answers that we may never get. In 2001, an Italian archaeologist, Mario Poglia, found a letter in the archives. It was a manuscript from the 16th century detailing a 10-day trip that the Inca civilization had made between Cusco and Paititi. Those who ventured on the journey to find the place never did, and today it's no longer a thirst for gold, but a desire to confirm the existence of the lost city. Many have become obsessed with finding the location, even centering their entire lives around it. Treasure hunters have gone searching for a lost city that may or may not even exist. The Le Griffin was a sailing ship built by René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, in his conquest to locate the Northwest Passage to China and Japan. The vessel was the first full-sized ship of its kind on the upper Great Lakes of America. It also led the way to modern-day commercial shipping. It was built and launched on Cayuga Creek in the Niagara River as a 7-cannon, 45-ton bark. La Salle and a Catholic priest boarded the boat on the 7th of August, 1679, with a crew of 32 people. They embarked on a voyage across Lake Erie, Lake Huron, and Lake Michigan, The ship was being guided through some uncharted waters. On the 18th of September that same year, LaSalle disembarked, and the ship was sent back to Niagara. It was upon this return journey from Green Bay, Wisconsin, that the ship would mysteriously vanish along with its fur cargo and 6 remaining crew members. It's thought that a stop had been made at either Washington or Rock Island. Often, Le Griffin is mistaken for the first ship to disappear on the Great Lakes, but that award lies with a 10-ton single-decked bark that was made by LaSalle. The ship would later be deemed the holy grail of the Great Lakes by the shipwreck hunters who've desperately tried to locate it. There are a number of antique sunken sailing ships that have been theorized to be Le Griffin, but none of these suggestions can be confirmed, and the missing vessel remains without identification. While this particular sailing ship wasn't the first of the thousands of others to make their way to the bottom of the Great Lakes, it was the second. Various theories have since come about regarding the fate of Le Griffin. Some suggest that it was ransacked, possibly by a rival fur trade. Others think that the native tribes of the Great Lakes set the ship ablaze. LaSalle, though, believed that the ship's pilot and its crew committed a mutiny. He suggested that they intentionally sank the ship and made off with the cargo. A prevailing theory is that the lost vessel was sunk by storm. The Roman Catholic priest allegedly wrote that they became tied up in a rather violent storm. Whether or not these suggestions answer the question of how Le Griffin sank still leaves many other questions unanswered, such as where the wreckage is and whether it will ever be found. There is no trace of the fur or even the crew aboard the ship that day, leaving the case as another intriguing mystery. In 2018, a shipwreck hunter couple, Stephen and Kathy Liebert, thought that they'd found the vessel 42 years after they began searching, but it couldn't be said with 100% certainty that this was indeed the missing ship. The Lieberts were convinced that they'd found the wreckage, but the truth may lie deep within the lake, where it's slowly being reclaimed by nature. Some are skeptical of the couple and their findings, but they maintain that the wreckage may lie near Poverty Island, but an official discovery is yet to be made. The Ghent altarpiece is an art installation that was finished in 1432 by the Van Eyck brothers and displayed at the St. Pavos Cathedral. It gained worldwide recognition as a fine piece of work and one of the most influential paintings to have ever been made. It contains a total of 12 oak panels forming a magical scene from the Bible using oil paint. This painting would also go on to survive dismemberment, illegal sales, and being engulfed in flames. No piece of art in history has endured the trials quite like this one has. The piece is also considered to be the most stolen artwork after panels of it have been looted 6 times since its completion. On the morning of the 11th of April in 1934, Ghent would awake to disastrous news. 2 of the altarpiece's panels had been stolen. Those 2 were the Just Judges and John the Baptist installations. The daring theft became one of the most intriguing art robberies of the 20th century and has since remained unsolved. A ransom note materialized in the bishop's mail soon after, demanding 1 million Belgian francs. To show his good faith, the thief left the John the Baptist panel at the checked luggage department of the train station, but the government refused to pay this ransom, and 11 more ransom notes were sent for the next 8 months. It was 8 months later that a stockbroker had suffered from cardiac arrest at a political rally. That evening, he summoned his lawyer, and they engaged in a 15-minute-long secret meeting. It was here that the man alleged that he was the only one who knew where the missing altarpiece panel was. He directed his lawyer to an unreleased letter that held a clue. The clue read the following, quote, "It rests in a place where neither I nor anybody else can take it away without arousing the attention of the public." To this day, amateur detectives and investigators search for the panel. The police station receives and investigates several tips that come in every year. The entirety of the cathedral even went under an X-ray scan in search of it, but nothing was found. During the Second World War, the third Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, sent an art detective to find the missing piece and intended to gift it to another, but the effort proved futile. In 2018, 2 Belgian writers held a press conference at Ghent City Hall, positing that the panel had been buried beneath the town square, a shopping district in the town's center. This notion came about when an engineer had taken a look at the rest of the clues that were left behind. In the last letter, there were 4 words left as some riddle. One of the men was able to link the words to specific points in the city, each of which was exactly 152 meters from a single point. Many suggested that this was a publicity stunt by the man who was releasing an upcoming book. Authorities also discouraged everyone from digging up the city square, so we can't be certain if the altarpiece really lies beneath it. A group of 16 people boarded the Intrepid, a 65-foot sailing boat, back in October of 1996. At the time, the seas in the area of Fort Pierce, Florida were rough, with waves reaching 7 feet high. At 9:04 p.m., the Coast Guard station received a distressed mayday call. The captain of the vessel explained that the starboard propeller shaft on the boat's motor was taking in water. This meant that it was sinking. The captain suggested that they were afloat 27 miles east of Fort Pierce, and that the passengers were safely boarding a life raft. They had with them a handheld radio along with signaling equipment. Life rafts are generally equipped with radio and smoke flares to signal for rescuers during the day, and regular flares for times of low visibility. After confirming that the call wasn't a hoax, a search team was sent out by air and water. The search began at 30 miles offshore, but they hadn't found the Intrepid. There was also no sign of the 16 people, their life raft, or even a signal to indicate where they were. A Coast Guard lieutenant, Robert Engel, stated that the search ensued around 10 p.m. that evening and involved 2 helicopters, a 110-foot patrol boat, a C-130 aircraft, and a Falcon jet. They searched 600 square miles of the Atlantic Ocean, but nothing was found, and the search was subsequently called off amidst the poor weather conditions of sporadic rains. Petty Officer Robert Gray from the station in Fort Pierce announced that the weather conditions made the searches more difficult, and the probability of finding the vessel or the crew went down. Rescuers found no sign of wreckage, which was incredibly unusual, according to Officer Jeff Hall of the Coast Guard Command Center. He stated that usually when a vessel like the Intrepid sinks, parts of it are cut loose at the top and float in the ocean, but the team didn't find anything like this. There was no debris, no signals, no wreckage, no raft, and no sailboat. The Intrepid and the 16 people on board were gone, never to be seen again. For centuries, the disappearance of the vessels and the aircraft have often been attributed to maritime folklore and the Bermuda Triangle. Other cases linked to this phenomenon are the more well-known vessels such as the USS Cyclops, Proteus, and USS Wasp. The case of the Intrepid sailing boat was no different, and many linked the sudden enigmatic vanishing to the Bermuda Triangle, where it disappeared without a trace. The Poor Poet is an odd canvas concept created by Karl Spitzweg, a German artist. It dates back to 1839, when a disturbed poet was depicted in an attic room. It shows the humor of a writer and his interesting atmosphere. According to the analysis done on this piece of art, the umbrella was placed there to stop rainwater from seeping in through the roof. In a civilized mess, books and bundles of newspapers can be seen. The poor poet himself holds a quill in his mouth and seems to be showing a nothing sign with one hand. The painting became a favorite among Germans, including dictators. Some Germans, according to a poll, had listed the Poor Poet as their second favorite painting, and the Mona Lisa being the foremost. It was this much-loved painting that would become the subject of thievery not once but twice. It was the 12th of December in 1976 when the German performance artist Uhle entered the Neue Gallery and took it. But this wasn't an act of art theft, but rather a theft that was considered art. Uhle was captured on black and white video, making the perfect getaway with the framed perfection. The performance artist recalled that this painting was a central aspect of his childhood. The video shows him taking the Poor Poet off the wall and running for an emergency exit, with the painting tucked under his right arm and alarm bells blaring as he fled. He dashed down the block as the snow fell, and 2 dark-suited guards sprinted after him. This public display captured who Uhle was as an artist and portrayed his thoughts on public access to art institutions, as well as the plight of Turkish workers in Berlin. He subsequently hung the artwork in the home of a Turkish family where he was filming a documentary. He then phoned the police and admitted to stealing it. He also told them that he'd only return it if the gallery director would come see it in its proper context. The painting was retrieved and placed at a different gallery, only to be the victim of theft again over a decade later. It was the 3rd of September in 1989 when a man in a red wheelchair entered the gallery with his companion pushing him along. No one suspected him of anything. Their sneaky efforts were carried out in broad daylight, but they failed when security noticed that they'd taken 2 of Carl Spitzwig's paintings, The Poor Poet and The Love Letter, off the wall after cutting the wires securing them there. He quickly confronted them but was assaulted. Leaving blaring alarms in their wake, the 2 men dashed for an exit and blended into a growing and chaotic crowd, leaving the red wheelchair prop behind. This time, the theft wasn't ideological, but carried out for monetary gain. And this time, they stayed silent. The 2 thieves were even ready to use violence if necessary to secure their efforts. The men were able to escape with the artworks in tow. None of these stolen artworks resurfaced on the market, which is why they've never been found. Art criminals are often only found when trying to sell these works. The Poor Poet never saw any untoward advertising, and its whereabouts to this day remain a mystery. Neither the thieves nor the artworks were heard from or seen again. The Mask of a Faun sculpture has been attributed to Michelangelo Buonarroti. It's believed that this piece was made when he was 16 years old, and that it's one of the artist's first sculptures to be made from marble. Michelangelo based this piece on an antique model of an old bearded faun. A faun refers to a class of rural gods that are represented as a man with goat horns, legs, tail, and ears. But the artist added some details that he believed the antique depiction was missing. His imaginative additions were the larger nose and open mouth of a laughing man. The piece landed on the sights of Lorenzo de' Medici, who pointed out that it would be unlikely for a man that old to have all of his teeth. This prompted the young artist to drill one of them out. It pleased Medici to see how quickly the man was willing to modify his sculpture. Amidst the 1940 war, the art collections that were held in Italy were subsequently transferred out of the city. The Florentine artworks were stored in villas that were privately owned in Tuscany. In 1942, the ongoing war pushed for more safekeeping of these treasures. This led to the sculptures from the Bargello, including the mask, being moved to the castle of Poppi in the Poppi village. On the evening of the 18th of August, 1944, a German officer arrived at the palace. He claimed to have been tasked with checking for concealed weapons. A few days later, a German captain, a second lieutenant, and a non-commissioned officer arrived there and insisted that they inspect each room again. They claimed that the village was a nest for rebels and spies. Their investigation proved violent. They would kick down doors and hold their weapons at all times. After rummaging through the castle, the soldiers requested that the municipal police carry a box that contained art to their truck. Just a few hours later, more soldiers showed up and instructed the townspeople to stay in their cellars. They obliged, and for this reason, there would be no witnesses to what came after. The German 305th Infantry Division began carrying boxes of art out of the castle, and by 6 a.m. the next morning, the trucks were gone. An inspection of the castle found broken walls, doors, and debris all over. The German soldiers would later claim that they were instructed to save the art pieces from the Anglo-American troops. Further inspection found that 198 pieces of art had been taken. It was concluded that these stolen works were from the notable artists such as Ingres, Raphael, Lippi, and Rubens. Some incredibly important Florentine collections were also grabbed, such as the Birth of Venus and Donna Madonna. In 1946, another report was issued, stating that 3 artworks had been stolen that night and have since remained missing. This included the Mask of a Faun, which no one has seen since 1944. Some have suggested that the Soviet troops had taken the mask when they invaded Berlin, while others believe that it lies in Moscow. These ideas have never been confirmed, and the Mask of a Faun remains missing to this day. On March 5, 1922, the famous explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton was laid to rest in a whalers' cemetery on the island of South Georgia. Exactly 100 years later, modern-day explorers rediscovered the ship that took him on his most famous expedition. By 1915, Shackleton had already made a name for himself as a polar explorer. He was one of the main explorers in what would become known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. Previous expeditions had included one which had beaten records for the furthest south anybody had ever achieved up until that point. But the race to the South Pole had been won a few years earlier, and Shackleton was looking for other adventures to take. The Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition aimed to be the first to travel across the frozen continent of Antarctica by foot. The crew would sail first to South Georgia, a British overseas territory, and then to Vassal Bay. The next stage was to travel across the ice to the South Pole, then onto the Ross Sea onto the other side of the continent. A three-masted ship named the Endurance was elected for the job. It left South Georgia in December of 1914 with a crew of 27 men. The journey to the Weddell Sea, south of South America, started well, but the ship soon became stuck in ice. Originally, Shackleton had hoped that the ship would be released from the ice in the spring, and they would continue the journey south until they reached the bay. But when the ice began to release the ship, he realized the damage was too severe. The order was made to abandon the ship, and the crew made a camp on the ice. What followed is one of the most famous stories of a daring rescue in the history of Antarctic exploration. The crew managed to make it to Elephant Island in just 3 lifeboats, but there was little chance of a rescue from there. Shackleton and 5 companions made the dangerous journey across the open ocean to South Georgia, a trip of 800 miles, and then across South Georgia to get help for the rest of the crew. Remarkably, all of the crew survived. Even though the expedition itself was a failure, the story of the rescue has gone down in history. Shackleton went on to have a short career speaking at lectures, but he still wanted adventure, and in 1921, he decided to go on one last journey. The Shackleton-Rowett expedition aimed to map out parts of the coast of Antarctica, but on the journey to South Georgia, Shackleton suffered a minor heart attack. He was still ill when he arrived at the island, but was determined to go on the mission. On January 5, 1922, he suffered another heart attack and passed away. His wife requested that he be buried on the island, and 2 months later, the ceremony took place. On the 100th anniversary of Shackleton's passing, many events took place to honor his memory. One of these was the launching of the Endurance 22 expedition, which left South Africa in February of 2022. There had been many expeditions to find the Endurance, but it had sunk in an extremely dangerous part of the ocean, which made searches difficult. The 2022 expedition benefited from a lack of sea ice. The ice was at its lowest extent since records began in 1970, but it was still a treacherous mission. Remote-control submersibles were used to search the sea floor around where the Endurance's captain had last recorded its position. After weeks of searching, the cameras panned across the hull of the ship on March 5, 2022. The ship was well preserved in the icy waters, although many sea creatures had already made it their home. The name was clearly visible on the stern. No objects were taken from the ship, but video footage was shared around the world. The expedition team then made their way to South Georgia, and a photograph of the ship was left at Shackleton's grave. Bill Barrelko rose to fame as a daring and passionate hockey player who helped the Toronto Maple Leafs to 4 Stanley Cup victories in just 5 years. But his hockey career was cut short by a tragic and mysterious plane accident. The search for Barrelko's remains would last 11 years and wouldn't end until the Leafs finally took the cup again. Barrelko was born in the gold mining town of Timmins in Ontario. Like many young boys from the area, he dreamed of becoming a professional hockey player. Even though he started learning to skate late, he learned quickly. He impressed talent scouts with his defensive play and would be picked up by the Leafs. In 1947, he got the call up for the senior team and immediately made an impression on both his teammates and the fans. Despite his youth and inexperience, he didn't let anybody push him around. The team took the Stanley Cup on 3 consecutive occasions, and a 4th time in 1951. The playoffs in 1951 were remembered as some of the greatest in the Cup's history. Each game went into overtime, but the Leafs had the advantage. On April 21, 1951, a victory for the team over the Montreal Canadiens would mean the team's 4th Cup in 5 years. The game was once again into overtime, but in the final minutes, Barrelko left his position on the blue line to score the winning goal. It was an incredible victory, and one that should have led to many celebrations. but just a few months later, Barelko would vanish without a trace. He left his home on August 24th to go fishing with a friend on Seal River, where James Bay meets Hudson Bay. It caused an argument with his mother, who was superstitious about Fridays and didn't want him to fly that day. The friend, a dentist coincidentally named Henry Hudson, would be the one flying them in a yellow Fairchild 24 float plane. Despite Barelko's mother's worries about Fridays, the friends would survive the weekend. It wasn't until that Sunday that anybody realized anything was wrong. The plane was overdue. The following day it still hadn't arrived and the search began. It was determined that Barelko and Hudson were last seen at Rupert House near the Quebec-Ontario border in the early afternoon. They had already unloaded several items of camping equipment to lighten their load, but still seemed to be struggling with weight. As they refueled, a local warned them of a storm that was coming and suggested they stay until it had blown over. But the two men said they had 120 pounds of fish and wanted to get home before it spoiled. They left not long after and disappeared into the wilderness. What followed was one of the largest search efforts in Canadian history. It made headlines across the country, and thousands of air hours were spent trying to locate the plane. Unfortunately, after about a month, the search had to be called off. The loss hung over the Leafs, who retired Barelko's number in his honor. Another slump followed, this time even worse than before. Rumors of a jinx arose, and it was said that the Leafs would never win again until Barelko was found. In 1962, it seemed that the jinx was finally lifted. 11 years and a day after Barelko scored his last goal, the team took the cup in a victory over the Chicago Blackhawks. In a strange coincidence, the crashed plane was located just 2 months later by a civilian pilot. It wouldn't be until June 6th that it was reached, 100 kilometers northwest of James Bay. Barelko and Hudson's remains were still in the cockpit and were brought back to properly be laid to rest. The cause of the crash was never determined, and it's still surrounded by mystery and conspiracy. In 1877, Asaph Hall discovered the moons of Mars. Two shiny, odd-shaped satellites orbited the red planet. By a strange coincidence, the same thing had been predicted by Jonathan Swift 150 years earlier. Swift wrote his famous book, Gulliver's Travels, in 1726. It was something of a satire of the traveler's tales genre that was popular at the time. The explorer, Lemuel Gulliver, visits many fictional nations, most famously the lands of a tiny race of people and a land of giants. But one country that's often forgotten about is the land of Laputa. Laputa is filled with crazy scientists who conducted experiments with little purpose, and according to Gulliver, had very bad reasoning. But it was in the land of Laputa where the now famous prediction about Mars's moons was made. Gulliver claims that the Laputians had discovered two satellites that revolve around Mars. He goes into detail about their orbital distances and lengths. The first is said to be exactly 3 planet diameters away from the center of Mars, and orbits in 10 hours. The second is 5 diameters away and orbits in 21.5 hours. He goes on to describe them as fitting the rules laid out by Kepler's third law of planetary motion, which states that the square of a planet's orbital period is proportional to the cube of its distance from the center of the orbit. Kepler had penned the law about 100 years before Gulliver's Travels was published. It was something that would have been familiar to Swift. The suggestion wasn't too wild. By this point, the moons of Jupiter had already been observed, and it was speculated that other planets might also have moons. As Mars was between Earth and Jupiter, astronomers speculated that it might have 2 moons. In fact, due to a strange coincidence, Kepler had already predicted Mars had 2 moons. In 1610, after observing Saturn's rings, Galileo had sent a coded message to Kepler. It was just a jumble of letters, but when unjumbled and translated into English, the message read, quote, "I've observed the most distant planet to have a triple form." But the letters could also be mixed to read something that translated to "Hail twin companionship, children of Mars." But even though there was speculation and guesses about Mars' moons, it would be a long time before anybody actually observed them. The Martian moons are some of the smallest in the solar system. It's believed they might be captured asteroids or debris left over from the formation of the planets. It wasn't until 1877 that anybody was even able to see them. But in August of 1877, Asaph Hall saw first the larger of the two moons, Phobos, and then the smaller, Deimos. They were named after two sons of the god Ares, and Mars's Greek counterpart. There are a lot of similarities between the two real moons of Mars and the predictions made by Swift, but they are more coincidences than actual predictions. The two moons orbit at a distance of 1.4 and 3.5 diameters from Mars's center, compared to the 3 and 5 mentioned in the book. The orbital periods are 7.7 and 30.3 hours, similar to the 10 and 21.5 reported by the Laputians. Many have speculated that Swift must have known more about the red planet than scientists at the time, but really he was using scientific knowledge from his period to make some coincidentally accurate guesses about what the Martian world might look like. In the early months of 1241, the enemies of the Mongol Empire were camped at the Danube River, preparing for a spring offensive against the city of Vienna. It would almost certainly have devastated the defenders there, and left the road open for the invaders to travel further west. But without warning, the army turned around and retreated to Mongolia. For the Europeans, it seemed like divine intervention. It was simply the coincidental timing of the passing of the Great Khan, but it had saved Europe from a dark fate. Ögedei Khan was the third son of Genghis Khan, who had inherited his title and empire after his passing. Ögedei's main focus had been on the east and conquering what was left of China, but he was also drawn to the west. The aim was to reach the Great Sea. From what the Mongols had seen in Europe, it seemed like a perfect battlefield for them. Throughout the late 1230s and into the 1240s, wave after wave of Mongolian forces struck Eastern Europe. They were nominally led by Batu Khan, the nephew of Ögedei, but the real commander was Subutai Khan. Subutai was a very competent military leader, and the European forces could do little to stop him. The Mongols were able to split up their army to make a multi-pronged attack. They also stoked divisions between European forces. For example, the Russian princes may have been able to hold off the Mongol forces if they were able to come to one another's defense, but the fights between them couldn't be put aside, even as a more devastating force overtook them. The invading forces would have been terrifying to the defenders. Even before any Europeans laid eyes on them, they would have heard horrifying stories from those who managed to flee the devastation. Towns that didn't surrender would be burned down, and everyone inside would lose their lives. Places like Poland, Hungary, and Ukraine would meet the same fate. Those who escaped were pushed west, causing upheavals even before the Mongols arrived. In late 1241, Subutai's army crossed the frozen Danube River. Scouts went ahead to gather information on Vienna's defenses, and small raiding parties devastated the surrounding settlements. The plan was for a full offensive when the summer came. But in December of that year, Ögedei Khan passed away. Exactly how he passed is uncertain, but the commonly told story is that he fell ill after a drinking bout with one of his hunting partners. Ögedei had already nominated an heir, but the transfer of power wasn't simple. There would need to be a Kurultai to decide the new leader. News traveled slowly, but in the first months of 1242, word reached the army. The leaders would have to return to the Mongol heartland for the vote, and the funeral of the Great Khan. The passing happened at a perfect time for Europe. Not only did this mean that Vienna would live to see another day, but it also gave them time to prepare against future invasions from the empire. They knew that this rest wouldn't be forever, and building projects were soon underway to create the fortresses that they'd seen could hold off the Golden Horde. Due to the coincidence of bad weather on the Asian steppes, they had more time too. But weather led to crop failures, and many of the soldiers who would otherwise have been part of the army lost their lives. The timing of this one event could have changed the fate of Europe and taken the world on a very different path than it otherwise would have gone. Sometimes in history, the timing of an event can have dramatic consequences on the future of the world. The events on a small island in the Mediterranean would have a lasting impact on not only Europe, but the rest of the world due to perfect timing. Today, Corsica is a part of France, but it hasn't always been that way. The island sits off the coast of Italy, just north of the island of Sardinia. It's been inhabited for 8,000 years and has changed hands countless times. In the Middle Ages, the fighting between Italian noble families eventually led to the church getting involved and granting the Pisa family control over the island. That also wouldn't last long, and in the 1200s, the Genoese took over. While it was officially under Genoese control, the Corsican people staged many revolts and wanted to control the island themselves. Most of these were quickly quashed, but in 1729, a revolt began that wouldn't be so easy to put down. This was in part due to the fact that the Corsican forces were receiving aid from the British. The Genoese also got outside help. They paid French troops to help take back the island, but even with the professional military, it was an uphill battle for them. In 1755, Corsica declared itself a republic, led by Pasquale Paoli. Genoa still had control over some important cities on the island, but it knew it wouldn't be able to hold on to them. Corsica had been a nearly constant problem for them since they had taken over, and they decided to give up the fight. Rather than giving in to the Corsican people, though, they sold the island to France in 1767. The purchase was validated in the Treaty of Versailles the following year. The Corsican people didn't see the act as legitimate, but there was little they could do. Now that France actually owned the island, they turned their full attention to the island. It was still a few years before the French army was able to put down the Corsican rebellion for good, but by 1789, the island was officially part of French territory. What made the timing of this so significant was the birth of a child on the island just a few months after the Treaty of Versailles. Charles Bonaparte was a minor Corsican noble who had served as an assistant to Pasquale Paoli. He'd been sent to represent the country in Rome, but was sent home in 1768. After the French takeover, the Bonaparte family initially fled to the mountains along with Paoli's other supporters, but had to return to town for the birth of Charles's fourth child, Napoleon. Charles then switched over to working for the French government and steadily rose up the ranks. His sons would go to school in mainland France, and Napoleon was in the right place at the right time to seize power after the French Revolution. The Corsican fight lasted 40 years. If it had gone for even a decade longer, or had started a decade later, Napoleon Bonaparte wouldn't have been born French, and it's unlikely that he would have been part of the French army if he'd been much older when the island was sold to them. The butterfly effect from this one purchase had a lasting impact on Europe, and as far away as the US. The consequences of what would have happened if the coincidental timing hadn't been just right are difficult to imagine. The Great Lakes are some of the most well-traveled bodies of water in the world, but they can also be some of the most dangerous. Countless ships have met their end at the bottom of the lake beds, often with crew members still aboard. But there are few stories more chilling than that of the SS Myron, and the strange coincidence of the fate of her longtime companion, the SV Miztag. The Myron was a wooden steamship built in 1888 that spent her 30-year career hauling lumber across the Great Lakes. For most of that time, she was also towing schooner barges. The SV Miztag was one such barge, which was often coupled with the Myron. The final voyage of the Myron started like any other. Together, the two ships were heavily loaded with lumber, with the Miztag carrying most of the cargo. They left Michigan on the morning of November 22, 1919, headed towards Buffalo, New York. But while they were out on the open water, a fierce storm hit. The high winds were accompanied by snow, and conditions quickly deteriorated. The Myron had a reputation for being reliable, but the aging ship couldn't withstand the waves. The hull began to break apart and take on water. The Myron's captain, Walter Neal, first tried to steer the ship and barge to the safety of Whitefish Bay. He realized they wouldn't both make it, though, and decided to abandon the heavy Miztag and the 7 men on board. The Myron continued to power towards Whitefish Bay until the water reached the boilers and the ship lost all power. The decision was made to abandon the ship, and all 17 crew members piled into lifeboats. Captain Neal stayed with the ship and managed to climb on top of the pilot's house when it broke away. 2 ships tried to rescue the sailors, as well as members of the Vermilion Life-Saving Station. One ship, the Adriatic, had tried to shield the Myron from the brunt of the storm. When that didn't work, the captain came around to try to launch a rescue attempt, but the shallow waters made it difficult for the Adriatic to get close. Ropes were thrown, but the sailors were unable to get a hold of them. A second ship also couldn't get close for the same reason. Hypothermia soon set in. By the time help reached them, the men in the lifeboats had already lost their lives. Miraculously, Captain Neal managed to survive and was rescued. After recovering, he would return to working on ships on the Great Lakes. Today, the wreck of the Myron sits at the bottom of Lake Superior, in an area now designated the Whitefish Point Underwater Preserve. Also part of the preserve is the Miztec. The Miztec survived the November 1919 storm, but sank in eerily similar circumstances 2 years later. She was being towed behind the Zilla on Friday, the 13th of May, 1921, when the ships hit a storm near Whitefish Point. The Zilla started to flounder in the hurricane-force winds and snow, so they cut loose the 2 barges she was towing. This time, the Zilla managed to survive the storm, but the Miztec wasn't so lucky. Aboard the Zilla, surviving as first mate was Walter Neal. The Miztec initially sank in shallow water, not far from important shipping lanes, and it was thought that she may be a hazard to other ships. But as her salt cargo dissolved, she slipped into deeper waters and came to rest not far from the Myron. Throughout history, there have been many examples of simultaneous invention and scientific discovery. Some of these are completely accidental and truly are just coincidences. Others are cases of multiple people working with the same information to come to the same conclusions. The case of the invention of the incandescent light bulb is an interesting subject. Most of the world knows Thomas Edison is the inventor of the first practical light bulb, but a very similar patent was filed in the UK by Jonathan Swan in the same year that Edison filed a patent for his bulb. Neither man can be credited as the sole inventor. Scientists and inventors around the world have been working on harnessing electricity to create artificial light for years. The light bulb changed the way societies worked and paved the way for countless other inventions that we use every day. So it's not surprising that many people had the same vision as Edison and wanted to make it a reality. By the 1870s, a lot of headway had already been made with electric lighting. The first electric light was demonstrated by James Bowman Lindsay in Scotland in 1835. He didn't take the project any further though, and it was the work of many other inventors that would make electric lighting a reality. Differences between bulbs focused on what exactly the filament inside the bulb was made from, as well as what gas, if any, would fill the glass. Different combinations of materials were experimented with, but most light bulbs only lasted a few hours at most. The ones that lasted longer were prohibitively expensive and couldn't be a commercial success. Both Edison and Jonathan Swan had the same ideas for how a light bulb could be made successful. Swan used a carbonized cotton thread as a filament, something he'd been working on decades before coming up with a successful light bulb. He realized that the problem was the vacuum technology available to him at the time. If any gases were left inside the bulb, they would escape when the light was used and create black soot that lined the inside of the bulb. It wasn't until the 1870s that the technology finally caught up to allow Swan's bulb to be a success. He claimed to have a working incandescent bulb in 1878 and demonstrated it the following year. He also filed for a patent that year. This was the same year that Edison filed for a patent in the US for almost the exact same design. Edison also used a carbonized cotton string. The main difference between the two designs was the thickness of the string. Edison used a very thin filament, which didn't have as high a resistance as Swan's design. It meant that the bulb would last longer and was a much more practical design. But even Edison could see that the two designs were extremely similar. Swan had already beaten 2 other lamp makers in court over infringements on his patent. Even though Edison had completely independently created his own bulb, if he were to bring it to the UK, there was a high likelihood that the courts would side with Swan. Rather than trying to argue that the small differences made the 2 bulbs unique, Edison's company combined with Swan's to create the Edison Company in the UK. The fact that the Earth witnesses solar eclipses at all is the result of a cosmic coincidence, but one that has shaped many events in human history. One of those is the Battle of Halley's, which earned the nickname the Battle of the Eclipse. What we know about the battle comes from the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, and modern scholars have questioned how much we can trust his accuracy. But the story has been preserved through the ages. The Battle of the Eclipse was the last fight in an ongoing war between Media and Lydia. The exact cause of the war is unclear. It may have simply been over land in Anatolia. But one dark story says that the king of the Medes had a disagreement with some hunters who fled to the capital city of Lydia. When he demanded the hunters be handed over, the king of Lydia refused and a war broke out. Whatever the cause, the war was in its 6th year when the Battle of the Eclipse took place. Both sides were evenly matched and, according to Herodotus, had both taken victories and defeats. The war showed no signs of stopping when the two armies faced one another on the banks of the Halys River in modern-day Turkey. The battle may have partially taken place at night, but it raged on into the day. According to Herodotus, the battle was reaching its height. The day suddenly turned to night as the moon passed in front of the sun. Both sides dropped their weapons as they saw it as a sign from the gods that the battle and the entire war should be ended. What started as a truce turned into a permanent end to the war. The daughter of the Lydian king was married to the son of the Median king, and the borders were determined by the river where the battle had taken place. While Herodotus is a famous historian, modern historians have questioned the accuracy of a lot of his writing, and this story is no exception. If the story takes place as Herodotus told it, then the date of the battle would have been May 28, 585 BC, and would have taken place shortly before sunset, rather than in the middle of the day. It also would have taken place 10 years after the passing of the king named by Herodotus in his texts. It's possible he simply mixed up the name, or that the date of the battle was actually even earlier. If this actually took place, it would be the earliest known example of a solar eclipse being predicted. According to Herodotus, the philosopher Thales had predicted the eclipse and warned the Ionians of the loss of light. While we can accurately predict solar eclipses today, this was not knowledge that the ancient Greeks were known to have. In fact, there were no other solar eclipse predictions in this time period. Some have speculated that he gained the knowledge from the ancient Egyptians, but if there were any eclipse predictions there, they've not yet been recovered. Another possible explanation is that this was a lunar eclipse rather than a solar eclipse. That would fit the stories of the battle partially taking place at night. If they'd been intending to fight by the light of the moon, its sudden disappearance would definitely have been a terrifying omen for the ancient people. For most, discovering a message in a bottle sounds like something from a fiction story rather than real life. The chances of finding one are extremely slim. But when Scottish fisherman Andrew Leeper spotted the neck of a bottle poking out from one of his nets, he knew what he was looking at, because his friend had already found a message in a bottle just a few years earlier. Both would set records for the oldest message in a bottle ever discovered up until that point. Andrew's discovery made headlines around the world in 2012. He was the skipper for the Shetland-based fishing vessel the Copias. The vessel was in the fishing ground east of Shetland, a popular spot for North Sea fishermen due to its abundance of life. Andrew's day was like any other when he pulled in his nets, which were filled with monkfish, megrim, and cod. Something in the net caught his eye, though. At the cod end, the neck of a glass bottle was poking out among the fish. He managed to grab the bottle before it fell back into the ocean. It was a clear glass bottle with a cork stopper, and a message wrapped tightly inside. Andrew had seen this sort of thing before at a museum, and had heard about one from his friend Mark Anderson. Mark was also a fisherman who'd worked on the Copias. In 2006, he'd spotted a very similar bottle in the same fishing grounds. It was a drift bottle designed for scientific research. Upon opening the bottle, he discovered a note that had been cast into the sea 93 years earlier. At the time, it was the oldest message in a bottle ever discovered, and Mark was very excited about his find. According to Andrew, his friend would boast about the find often. So it was even more exciting for Andrew when he discovered his message was even older than the one his friend had found. Andrew used pliers and a welding rod to get the postcard out of the bottle. Rather than something romantic or a distressed cry for help, it was much more mundane, but still a fascinating note. The bottle was labeled 646B and had been thrown into the ocean in June of 1914 by Captain C.H. Brown for the Glasgow School of Navigation. The purpose of the bottle was to map the currents near the sea floor around Scotland. They were specifically designed to sink and follow the currents deep beneath the ocean's surface. The note contained a postcard asking the finder to send it to the Glasgow School of Navigation with information about when and where the bottle was found. A reward of 6 pence was offered. During the experiment, 1,890 bottles were released. Only a little over 300 were returned, but as each bottle was returned, the information was added to the record. This helped scientists better understand the seas around Scotland. During the 19th and 20th centuries, this was the best way to understand what was happening deep beneath the surface, and helped ocean scientists, as well as those who relied on the waters for their livelihoods. Andrew described finding the bottle as like winning the lottery twice. Both he and Mark had been aboard the same vessel when they made their discovery, and both had beaten the previous record for the oldest message found in a bottle. Today, older messages have been uncovered, some more than 100 years old, but the 2 Shetland messages still rank as some of the oldest ever found. On January 30th, 1835, a man tried to take the life of President Andrew Jackson. It was the first time someone had tried to take the life of a sitting president of the United States, and it was only due to a lucky coincidence that the attempt wasn't successful. Jackson was a controversial figure. He was now in his 6th year as president and had made many enemies. He used his veto power more than any other president and was accused of acting like a dictator. His own former vice president, John Calhoun, had left to join a party set up in opposition of Jackson. The issues people had with Jackson were wide-ranging, and it led to a speech by Calhoun that called Jackson a Caesar, who ought to have a Brutus. He also earned the nickname King Andrew. But political differences were being put aside for a gathering at the Capitol building that January day for the funeral of Warren Davis. Almost as soon as Jackson arrived, the peace was broken. An unemployed house painter in his 40s had been waiting for the president to arrive. He emerged from behind a pillar and fired a weapon at the president. The cap was fired, but the bullet wasn't released. Undeterred, Lawrence pulled out another weapon. Jackson was in his 60s and seemed frail. He used a cane and leaned on others as he walked, but that didn't stop him from charging his attacker. Lawrence attempted to fire again, only for a second misfire. The only person wounded in the attack was Lawrence himself, who Jackson struck with his cane. According to one witness, the attacker would have met a much worse fate had there not been people holding the president back. After Lawrence had been subdued, Jackson's friends tried to gather around him, but he ordered them to stand back. He was worried someone might try to strike him with a bladed weapon while he was in a crowd. Lawrence was arrested, and soon the accusations and conspiracy theories began to spread. Jackson accused his political enemies of hiring Lawrence, while they accused Jackson of setting up the whole thing for sympathy. But as soon as Lawrence's trial began, it was clear that he was mentally unwell. Lawrence was born in Britain sometime around 1800, but moved to Washington with his family in 1812. His father had passed away, and Lawrence blamed Jackson for his passing. That alone wouldn't be too strange, even though there doesn't seem to be any connection between the older Lawrence and Jackson. Much stranger was the fact that Lawrence believed he was the rightful king of England, and possibly King Richard III. He believed that he had control over the American colonies and that Jackson was preventing him from receiving payments because he hadn't reauthorized the Second Bank of the United States. Even though the issue of the Second Bank was a controversial issue in Washington at the time, it was clear to all present that Lawrence was not acting as part of some grand conspiracy. The only way that Jackson's political opponents might have influenced events was by the nickname King Andrew, which would have upset Lawrence. Lawrence spent the rest of his life in mental health institutions, while Jackson served the rest of his presidency. It was later discovered that there were no issues with either of Lawrence's weapons, and they were fired successfully during tests. The chances of both misfiring were estimated to be 125,000 to 1. Our journey through time takes us to an area 10 miles from Silver City, in the western part of Chatham County. Here we encounter the Devil's Tramping Ground, a feature with a written history tracing back to the 1800s. A picture from the early 1950s reveals a signboard with a chilling inscription, reading "The Devil's Tramping Ground." But the story of this mysterious place begins in 1882, the year an article was written about it. It details the story told by the indigenous tribes in the area. The tribes exhibited a superstitious dread of the 40-foot wide circle of soil that harbors no microorganisms and no decaying matter. The author of the article found it challenging to get one of these local tribes to visit the circular grounds, but he eventually succeeded. The purpose was to dig into this strange patch of dirt, but after getting 3 feet down, they would find nothing. There was no explanation for the supposed supernatural energy that it gives off. One man's grandfather, who's thought to have been born in the early 1800s, stated that the circle looked unchanged since he first saw it decades earlier. This is because the patch allows no plant life to grow in it, and despite being surrounded by a forest, no seed of a tree dares to settle and grow there. In the 1930s, local newspapers jumped on the story too, detailing the story of a great beast that chases any living thing away from the tramping ground should they come near it. The beast is said to look something like a black bear. As the 1940s approached and the mystery persisted, scientists decided to test the soil. The W.A. Bridges Laboratory in Wilson conducted tests and sent samples to Dr. I.E. Miles, the director of soil testing in the NC Department of Agriculture. The test confirmed what was already known: the soil was sterile. But the reason for this circle of sterile soil and its persistence over centuries remained a baffling enigma. By the 1950s, this supernatural entity had become a tourist attraction. It had initially been visited mostly by locals until the aforementioned signboard was erected to attract the wandering crowd. Typical sorts of vegetation surrounded the circle, but it remains barren, aside from a wiry type of grass that cannot thrive outside of its borders. Objects placed within the patch by visitors are often flung from it or mysteriously cleared away by the following day, no matter how heavy said object is. Some believe that this was a meeting place for an ancient Native American tribe who purposefully made the earth bare for ceremonial dances. Adding to the mystery, no animal will ever cross over the patch, and some have reportedly seen red demonic eyes appearing within the circle in the middle of the night. One journalist who worked for the Greensboro paper decided to spend the night at the circle with his 2 hounds in an attempt to disprove the stories. But what he experienced that night would send him on a different route. While sleeping in his tent, the reporter heard ghostly footsteps circling him, unable to figure out their source. It's been thought that perhaps this is the territory of a nocturnal animal, or the devil himself. Some personal experiences add credence to the idea that this is a hotspot for paranormal ongoings. One such story came from Reddit. One user who lives in central North Carolina took a trip into the woods when he was 18 years old, along with friends. Between them, they only had one flashlight, and after walking for some time, they managed to find the tramping ground. After spending a couple of minutes there, they decided to leave and headed back to the car, but they reportedly felt as though they were being watched. After driving for a bit, the group came to a 4-way stop where a daycare was located. There was a swing set in the grounds with 4 swings. 3 of these swings stayed perfectly still, but one of them began to move as though someone was sitting on it. It wasn't particularly violent, according to the user, but it was enough to creep a person out. The friends tried to find logical explanations, like an animal brushing past it, or jumping off of it when the car neared, but it didn't slow down as they watched but maintained the same pace. It was as though whatever ghostly presence had followed them from the grounds was watching them in a playful and terrifying manner. Number 9. Probably one of the creepiest alien abduction stories came in 2001. The event took place on the 4th of October at the Gundaya property in Australia. This occurrence would become known as the Gundaya Mackay abduction. 3 people were involved in this event, including 40-year-old Keith Rylance, his 22-year-old wife Amy, and a business partner, 39-year-old Petra Heller. The property had been developed as the Whispering Winds Winery, and other activities were also taking place there. Their story was told sporadically through one-on-one interrogation with the group and through television interviews. The 3 had been staying in a caravan, and at 9:30 that evening, Keith headed off to bed. Petra went into the caravan annex while Amy sat in the lounge area and watched TV. The rooms were all in close proximity and merely separated by a window or a wall. It was explained that the room that Petra stayed in led directly into the lounge, and on this evening, the door to her room had been left ajar. Keith's bedroom door opened up in the lounge room where Amy had fallen asleep. A storm had been circulating overhead as the group settled down for the evening. The events that would continue to haunt the 3 for the rest of their lives began at 11:15 that night, when Petra awoke suddenly and entered the lounge. There, she would find herself in shock, staring at an odd yet extraordinary sight that would soon overwhelm her. She told interviewers that a strong rectangular-shaped beam of light had entered through an open window of the lounge room. According to the reports, the end of this beam appeared shortened and truncated. Also, at the end of the beam was Amy, who was lying there in a sleeping position. What happened next shocked the community, which would later hear of the ordeal. The sleeping woman was being carried out of the open window head first by the beam, which also mistakenly grabbed a few items that had been left around on the coffee table. Petra also found the source of the rectangular light, which was a flying disc hovering not far from the caravan, and stationed immediately behind the caravan house. Petra thinks that she may have fainted or maybe blacked out for just a few seconds, and when she came to, screams emitted from her mouth. Keith was awoken by the commotion that bellowed from the roommate and came from his bedroom into the lounge area. And there he would find Petra beside herself and the items from the coffee table lying below the window. According to the interview that Keith was subjected to later on, he realized that the screen on the window had an incision that ran vertically. When he found that he couldn't get any information out of Petra, who was crying and in an agitated state, he headed outside to search for his wife, soon realizing that she wasn't there. Keith managed to pull himself together, head back into the caravan, and confront the terrified woman. She was able to deliver fragments of the story, but the man didn't believe her and again went outside trying to find Amy. Around 11:40, he called the police and reported that his wife had been abducted. Keith implored that the police should come out, but there was a delay. An hour and a half later, Senior Constable Robert Maragna and another officer from Maryborough arrived there. The cops believed that they were about to head into a situation that involved foul play or a homicide scene. But when they arrived, they were shocked to hear of the bizarre events that took place and the allegation of a UFO that had taken Amy Rylance. Later, the officers were joined by Sergeant John Bosnag, and the three began investigating the site. Their first observation was that the two witnesses were agitated, and the second was that Amy was gone. They then had a look at the torn window screen, and shortly after discovered that a flowering bush located nearby had been scorched to some degree, but another flowering bush next to it sustained no damage. Later that night, the police received a phone call from McKay. A woman had been found there who seemed dehydrated and in distress. It was Amy, 790 kilometers away. Number 8. The involvement of two important people and the disappearance of a twin-engine 310 Cessna have garnered widespread interest in the Alaskan Triangle, the Alaskan version of the Bermuda Triangle, where aircraft and people mysteriously vanish. The triangle is formed using Anchorage, Juneau, and Barrow. It's within this boundary where some of the most enigmatic disappearances have taken place, with this one being one of the more controversial ones. The mystery began in 1972, the year of the general elections, where the state representative, Nick Begich, who was locked in a race against his rival, Republican Don Young, decided to ask support from the House Majority Leader and Congressman Hale Boggs from Louisiana. He obliged with this request, and in October of that same year, the two hopped onto the small twin-engine 310 Cessna plane, along with pilot Don Johns. They were headed for the capital of the state, Juneau, but along the trip, the aircraft had lost contact with ground support. A quick response was formed using a joint force consisting of the Navy, Coast Guard, and Air Force, and a large search mission ensued. For over a month, the authorities from various fields combed the areas of forest, mountain peaks, and tundra of Alaska. Despite this massive investigation, though, not one piece of the plane's wreckage was ever located, nor were the remains of any of the passengers on that flight. The search operation was described as one of the largest at one point in the United States history. The search included 40 military aircraft, 50 civilian planes, and 3,600 hours of searching. Despite this, the Cessna had vanished into thin air. This disappearance and search efforts made headlines, and with no success or any leads for 39 days, those efforts had to be called off. This event allowed for a new law to be passed that mandates all aircraft within the United States to be equipped with an emergency tracking device. This would enable the rescuers to locate the wreckage quickly and arrive at the scene in time to tend to the passengers. Conspiracy theories surrounding this enigmatic disappearance have since come about. The theories mainly center around Bogg and his membership with the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission had been tasked to investigate the assassination of President John F. Kennedy by President Lyndon B. Johnson. He disagreed with the majority report supporting the thesis of a lone assassin. Boggs was said to have had some strong doubts about this, and author Robert Ludlum depicted the congressman as being a victim of yet another assassination in order to stop his probe into the 1963 event. Number 7. In 1990, Unsolved Mysteries released its 3rd season. One of the episodes in this season was the story of the Woods home, which was one of the creepiest hauntings ever. The episode detailed the experience that Ed and Mary Woods would go through at their 37th Street, Vancouver, Washington home. It was unlike any other house in the suburban area, which the couple would move into in December of 1994, along with their daughters. The idea was that this move would be a fresh start for the family, but it became apparent that they weren't the only ones living on the property. For the initial 6 to 7 months, the Woods had been living a regular life, which would take a haunting turn. It began one evening when Mary heard the sound of a music box, prompting a search for where it was coming from. The trail of music led her to Ed's office, but when she looked around there, she couldn't find it. Despite not being able to locate where it was coming from, Mary continued to hear the music sporadically. She wasn't the only one who heard things, though. Ed had been in his office one day with the door shut when he suddenly heard the sound of the doorknob jiggling. He initially thought that it must have been his daughter and decided that he would catch her in the act, but when he opened the door, there was no one there, which compelled him to check the house, only to find that everyone was asleep. After this, Mary contacted a seismologist, who confirmed that there was no seismic activity at the time of these events. Not long after, the apparitions began to appear. Mary reportedly saw a woman wearing a nightgown and a scarf wrapped around her head. This ghostly woman was said to also check in on their daughters from time to time. She later discovered that the spirit she was seeing belonged to a former resident who passed away from cancer in the house back in 1974. The resident was also known to wear nightgowns and scarves during their illness. The spirit had once occupied the room that the two girls had slept in. Ed had his fair share too. He once saw the figure of a man they called the Riverboat Gambler. There was also the entity of a girl in a pink dress who wandered around the house and let out a giggle whenever anyone saw her. The couple and their children would regularly find items disappearing and reappearing somewhere else, hear odd noises, and witness objects floating in the house without any explanation. Number 6. 18-year-old Kyra Cook forgot what her life was like after making a fateful trip to the Longview, Washington post office in 1986. It was the 8th of September when Kyra had lunch with a friend before heading over to the post office to drop off the mail. Around 2:15 that afternoon, she exited the post office, and the events that followed would remain a mystery for Kyra, her family, officers, and the world. About 45 minutes after leaving the office, she awoke with a severe headache. The woman was confused and didn't know where she was or even who she was. In a dazed state, she began to cross over to the park where an older gentleman met her. He drove her to the police station, but dropped her off half a block away from the front door. He never told her who he was and refused to help her any further. At around 3:15, Deputy Joe Rice from the Cowlitz County Sheriff's Department was heading out when he found the woman scared and confused. Kyra spoke with the officer outside of the building and relayed her situation. She was soon taken to the hospital, where a small bump on her head was found. Doctors believed that she may have been struck from behind or possibly had fallen. This would also explain the amnesia that Kyra was experiencing. She lost the memories of who she was, what happened to her, and of her family. In an effort to figure out who the woman was, the officers had her picture posted in the newspaper, and 24 hours later, her parents came forward. After 5 days in the hospital, Kyra was allowed to go home with her parents and to some familiar surroundings. Unfortunately, the home, her bedroom, and her personal belongings never triggered any memories. She also experienced a loss of both taste and smell, and has had trouble retaining memory since the occurrence. Deputy Rice theorized that she'd been trying to dodge a vehicle and was struck down, knocking her head. Alternatively, it's believed she could have been struck from behind during an assault or a mugging. The investigation into the situation found that she'd been carrying a brown paper bag with makeup and money inside of it. When she woke up, though, this was no longer with her. After searching the park and the surrounding area, Kyra's mother, Gloria, found no sign of the bag. Later, a local girl who resembled Kyra came forward and spoke of being attacked 3 times by a stranger in the park. This brought about another theory that stated that the assailant mistook Kyra for the other woman. Some believe that the solution to this mystery can be found in the man who dropped the amnesia-affected woman off at the station. Number 5. Starlight is a dark, mysterious material invented by a hairdresser. It's so fireproof and heat-resistant that it can withstand several explosions, and then it disappears. This mystery starts in the 1980s, when Maurice Ward, a British hairdresser from Hartlepool, enjoyed the art of invention during his spare time. In the 1980s, he purchased an extruding machine that was being sold by the local chemical plant. Immediately, Ward began experimenting with manufacturing various materials. First, he tried to make one that could be used on cars, but the result was a disappointment that would soon be discarded. Ward later learned of the air disaster that took place at the Manchester airport and became obsessed with developing flame-proof substances. He ended up retrieving the results of the experiment that he'd done on car hoods and mixing them with other solvents using his kitchen blender. After putting this mixture through the extruder, Ward discovered that the sheets of this newfound material would withstand the heat of a blowtorch and dubbed it Starlight. He showed incredible faith in his invention and went as far as placing it on his hand and blasting the blowtorch at it. He was surprised when he discovered that the heat didn't penetrate through the plastic substance. At its most basic, this enigmatic material is a special polymer with intense insulation properties. It was said to be ultimately resistant to the most aggressive heat. The substance met the public eye in 1993, after being featured on an episode of the science and technology show Tomorrow's World that aired on BBC. In this episode, a raw egg was painted with a layer of starlight and then placed under the intense heat of a blowtorch for 5 minutes. Once the heat ceased, the egg was shown to have no scorch marks, and when cracked open, it was still raw. This same substance was placed in a simulated environment in which high-powered energy was used to mimic the heat equivalent of a nuclear blast. The material came out perfectly fine, aside from a tiny scorch mark. Starlight was hailed as an impossible material and soon attracted the attention of various corporations, but no one was able to secure a patent and was unable to produce the material for commercial use despite its world-changing properties. It could have saved thousands of lives related to the transportation industry and space exploration. If it could be so life-changing, then where exactly is it, and why is it not being used? The more tests that Starlight was subjected to, the more interested companies became. Because of this, Ward's demands and actions became more eccentric, making it more difficult for these companies to negotiate with him. He declined to send samples to other places for fear that they would be reverse engineered. Then in 2011, Ward began to ease up and eventually said that he would patent it. Unfortunately, that same year, he passed away before ever sharing the substance or its properties. According to the inventor, his family knew the secret formula, but to this day, no one has come out with it. How Starlight was made and what the ingredients were are a secret that was laid to rest with Maurice Ward. Number 4. Situated in the lush greenery of Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, there lies a fortified summit of Citadel Hill, Fort George. While the star-shaped fort, created in 1749, may be a stunning sight in the daylight, the darkness brings with it something truly disturbing. The fort was established during Father Le Loutard's War and was used to protect the settlers against raids carried out by the French, Acadians, and the Wabanaki Confederacy. It was reconstructed several times until 1856 and has since remained the same. 4 different forts have been constructed here, and although this one never saw combat, it did serve as a strategic area that protected the Navy. It's also Fort George, which is considered to be one of the most haunted places in Canada. Many stories lead us down paths where we meet hundreds of ghosts that have only piled on over the 300+ years of existence. Some explorers who ventured through the fort have reported seeing strange, unexplained apparitions. One of the most well-known and most circulated among the ghost stories is that of a ghostly girl who follows behind tour groups. Those who have experienced this say that it's as though she's trying to join them, but is too shy to go through with it. A few of the tourists documented instances where she even tried to grab hold of their hands. Another entity that roams Fort George is that of a soldier, who's been seen multiple times walking into a room of the fort's prison area. Once in the room, though, the figure vanishes. The stories hadn't just come from the visitors either. A guard on duty at the Citadel had seen a man pop up on the security cameras. He tried to find the man, but never could, and reported that it was as though he disappeared into thin air. Many have also seen a lady, a man wearing a red cloak, and an older woman who said to show herself in a mirror. Tourists and other kinds of visitors have claimed to feel as though they're being watched while exploring the area. There have also been instances of disembodied voices, bangs, and knocking sounds that send the visitors fleeing out of terror. Today, ghost tours are offered to tourists who wish to experience the ghostly phenomenon for themselves. According to one article, old fort employees were interviewed, and newspapers were scoured to uncover a staggering 36 ghost stories, with the numbers rising as time went on. Number 3. Erin Marie Gilbert was born in May of 1971 in Everett, Washington. She was described as tall, intelligent, and athletic. In 1994, she moved to Alaska to live with her sister Stephanie and her family at the Elmendorf Air Force Base. The following year, she met David Combs at a local bar, known as Kilcoot Charlie's or Coots. There, the two would exchange numbers, and later, Erin would agree to a date. Little did she know that this date would spark a manhunt and a mystery that plagued the community for ages. Stephanie remembered the events as though they'd been yesterday. It was that day that Erin, who was planning on enrolling into a cosmetology school, headed out on her first date at the Girdwood Forest Fair in Girdwood, Alaska, and her date's version of events would be placed under some of the most intense scrutiny. Before heading out, the 24-year-old woman was subjected to pleading of her younger nephew. His plea was for her to take a cell phone with her, but Erin insisted that she didn't need a phone and that it would be perfectly fine. So on the 1st of July in 1995, she left with her date, and they drove down together to the fair, which was located just an hour away from her sister's residence. Unbeknownst to anyone at the time, Alaskan state troopers would later have to gather some witnesses. This was because Erin Gilbert would mysteriously disappear that day. These witnesses reportedly last saw the couple at a beer garden, where they departed around 6 that afternoon. Combe explained that after the excursion, they headed back to his car but found that the vehicle's lights had been left on, and the battery had been run down. Combs told his date to stay in the car while he headed out to a nearby friend's place to ask for help. He claimed to have walked a lengthy 2 hours but seemed to have gotten the wrong address, which made him return to the car a bit later. When he arrived there, he found that Erin was gone, figuring that she'd headed back to the fair. Strangely though, when he started the car this time, it worked. Worried about his date, the man went back to the fair, as well as to locate the woman. He told investigators that he searched for her until 1 a.m. the following day. By this time, he concluded that she may have gone back home by herself, so Combs decided to head back home. A few hours later, he phoned Stephanie to make sure that his date had arrived home and was okay. At this moment, they realized that Erin was missing. They embarked on a search of all the areas that they thought she may have gone, but she wasn't at any of them. This encouraged them to involve the aforementioned state troopers. It wasn't until the sister got a hold of a local news station that the police department would carry out an extensive search operation. This search involved cadaver dogs and helicopters. Unfortunately, not a single hint of the woman was ever found. The police indicated that they had no reason to suspect foul play in the disappearance, giving the family hope that Erin would one day return. Erin's family also maintains a Facebook page dedicated to finding her, and regularly returns to Alaska to distribute flyers. Anyone who has information on the case is asked to contact the Missing Person Clearinghouse at 907-269-5038. It's been over 20 years since the disappearance, and there have been no arrests, no body, and no new leads. Erin Gilbert vanished. Number 2. Do you know what your house or apartment was built upon? Chances are you're lucky to be located on dirt and rock, but in some parts of the world, homes and complexes may be built upon an earlier aspect of the town. Some parts, like the Newport subdivision in Crosby, Texas, are where the 19th Black Hope Cemetery was located, past tense because the graveyard would later be built over and become a housing subdivision. There are houses that people would move into, settle down in, and start a family in. As you may have guessed, given the clue word cemetery, this story involves ghosts and is one of the more creepy paranormal mysteries. In 1982, the new houses saw their first string of inhabitants, one of which was a married couple, Sam and Judith Haney, who were added to the list of various other couples who'd bought a house in the Newport region of Houston, Texas. Alongside them were Ben and Jean Williams, the immediate neighbors. Little did the couples know that they would also be added to the list of people who experienced some genuinely terrifying events at this location. Judith and her husband settled into what they thought would be their dream home. 1 year later, though, they were shocked to discover that their house had been built upon victims who perished during the 1930s. It was in 1983 that the couple was tasked with doing some digging to uncover the remains of two individuals, later identified as Charlie and Betty Thomas. Aside from being alarmed at this newfound knowledge, the couple was also plagued by guilt after learning that they had desecrated the Thomases' graves and decided to rebury them. But it was too late. The graves were already disturbed. The Haneys soon became the targets of spirits who were out to taunt and torment. One evening, Judith had found that her bedroom clock was sparking and emitting a blue glow. When she went to check it, the clock was unplugged, but by who would remain a mystery. Sam was working night shifts, and on a separate evening, Judith was again left by herself. She had just had a shower when she heard the sound of a sliding door opening and closing, followed by the question, "What are you doing?" Initially, the woman thought it was her husband, but he wasn't there. Everything in the house was quiet, and all of the doors were locked up. She told herself that the guilt was probably really getting to her, but when she awoke the following day, Judith would experience another traumatic event. She had been in search of her red shoes and discovered that they weren't in any of the places where she would have kept them. The Haneys decided to look outside for the shoes after failing to locate them inside. Placed on top of one of the grave sites were the shoes, side by side. The cherry on top of this story was that it was the day of Betty Thomas's birthday. Then we head over to the William residence, where Ben and Jean were finding that their plants kept dying wherever they planted them. Sinkholes would randomly appear near the flower beds, and even if they tried to fill them up again, the holes would reappear. The Williams would often see unexplained shadows traveling across their walls and hear some disembodied voices. The two would also begin to smell something putrid that they couldn't identify. Their grandchild, Carly, who was living with them, would also experience some odd occurrences. She reported that the toilets would flush by themselves, and when the water went down, she could hear conversations taking place. Carly and her grandmother also heard someone walking toward them one day while they were taking a nap, but nobody was there. After quite some time, Jean opted to leave the house, but Ben insisted that they stay and fight. Ben had encountered two spirits in the house who went straight down the hallway toward the bedrooms. They were standing over his wife, who was asleep in the room, and quickly jumped onto the bed, fearing for his wife's safety. Their haunting, though, was far from over. Number 1. We now find ourselves in one of the most haunted forests in North America, the Pine Barrens, home of the Jersey Devil. The Pine Barrens are home to many legends and stories that have been circulated since the era of oral folk tales. The rich in history site is an extensive woodland that covers a considerable portion of New Jersey. It's found between two large cities, Philadelphia and New York, where the soil is acidic, sandy, and lacks nutrients. The Pine Barrens, the Pinelands, or simply the Pines, take over 1.1 million acres of land. It began during the Tertiary era, which took place 2.6 million years ago. Aside from the rare pygmy pitch pines and other infrequent plant species, this is also the place of ghosts, the terrifying Jersey Devil, and multiple ghost towns. For ages, many legends surrounding the forest have been doing the rounds. Over time, these creepy tales change, but their central character remains consistent. The Jersey Devil, a familiar story, began in the 1700s, when settlers first arrived in the area. The story starts when Jane Leeds gives birth to her 13th child, that she exclaims as the devil. The creature that resulted in this pregnancy was one bearing a pointed tail and wings. After attacking everyone nearby, it flew off. It took a little while for sightings to start occurring. They began in 1901, when residents of Bristol, Pennsylvania saw the terrifying creature. Sightings of this entity are still high today in the Pine Barrens. Campers, hikers, and other types of visitors have reported seeing winged beasts or unidentified animals. But as mentioned, this woodland isn't just home of the 1700s cryptid. Some creepy ghost towns can also be found here. Some have nicknamed the area Ghost Forest due to the real abandoned towns that were inhabited during the 18th and 19th centuries, which are believed to still be in use, but by non-human entities. Glass factories, paper mills, and cranberry farms litter the surrounding area. One of the more well-preserved of such places is that of the Batstow Village, a bog iron town. It's been named the Jewel of the Pines and is filled with iron and glass-making stones. It was also this town that made the cannonballs for George Washington's army. It comes as no surprise that this abandoned village has seen a few ghost sightings. One spirit that can be found in the Pine Barrens is James Still. He was a victim during the era of slavery and met his demise for practicing medicine. Other accompanying ghosts include the Blonde Woman, the Black Hound, a White Stag, and a Headless Entity, who are said to appear to visitors of the forest. Another one of the well-known entities that lurk here is that of John Bacon. John was a member of a gang that preyed on rebels during the 1700s and is believed to have passed away in 1783. John, along with his other outlaws, raided and pillaged many within the Pine Barrens until he became a victim himself. It's believed that even though he met his demise, there may still be a chance that he roams the pines, looking for his next victim or more treasures to get his hands on. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.